y en a qui étaient dans le petit train? It was good? Okay, great. Voilà, donc je sais.
All right, I know that you're all digesting, but we will start again on a theme that's quite dear to me, Bitcoin and watchmaking.
C'est ça aussi, le paradigme Bitcoin.
That's also this, the Bitcoin paradigm, statistical organization.
Yeah, exact. Bon, le prochain panel.
The next panel is entitled In Search of the Least Common Denominator. Shona will start with a presentation, then we will hear Théo Pantamis, and then there will be a roundtable to discuss the subtleties of UTXOs and watch complications. Thank you very much.
Alors, bonjour ou rebonjour à tous.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation. Between Bitcoiners and watchmakers, I am one of the watchmakers. I am an independent watchmaker. For those who do not know much about watchmaking, being an independent watchmaker means doing all the operations for manufacture of a watch. It's very varied in large companies. Very often they are very definite sectors. So the first stage to build a watch is to build it on a computer with all the calculations for the couples, cogs, inertia, speed, etc. Once you've done all of this on the computer, you will start machining the components. So you will start preparing wheels, pinions. You will start really working with the material. It will be sawed, hammered, polished. Once you have machined those pieces, you will start decorating them. That means polishing them, playing with the light. And once those components have been decorated, they will be assembled, and then you end up with a watch that is running, that can show the hours, the minutes or not. It can also include other complications, and this depends on all the calculations made initially. So I prepared a short, quick video. It's just 1 minute long, just so that you can see the atmosphere in my workshop. So as you've seen, or maybe you didn't see it in my workshop, there are no digital commands, large machines. All my machines are over 50 years old. Initially, this was a financial choice because I couldn't buy large machines, but then I realized that building pieces by hand had a different value than digitalized pieces that would be created with modern machines. And so I really focused on this area of work.
Et donc voilà, ça fait 4 ans que je me suis mis
So,
à mon compte et j'ai
I
commencé à travailler sur
started
ma
my
première
company
montre.
4 years ago, and I started working on my first watch 2 years ago. This is the prototype here that you can also see on the floor
Dans
above.
cette montre-là, donc j'ai réalisé
In this
toutes les étapes
watch,
que je vous ai dit
I
avant,
carried out
donc,
all the
la
steps that I
fabrication
mentioned,
sur
so
ordinateur,
building on the
l'usage des pièces.
computer,
Pour
machining
vous
the
donner un ordre d'idée,
pieces.
par exemple,
To
une
give you an
montre, on va la
idea,
faire
a
de
wheel,
manière
when
traditionnelle,
you do it in a
donc à la
traditional
main,
way,
il nous
so
faut
by
entre
hand, you
2
need
à 3 jours.
about 2 to 3
Donc on
days.
part d'un bout de laiton pour
If you
arriver à
start
une montre,
with a
à
piece
une
of
roue,
nickel
pardon, qui
to
est
achieve
dentée, découpée, qui a des bras vraiment
finished
bien définis,
wheel
qui
with
sont
well-defined arms,
Quand dans
etc.
l'industrie, il faut moins d'une minute
But
pour
in
avoir
the
une montre comme ça.
industry,
Donc il y a
you
vraiment
need
un
less
travail
than a
qui est
minute
différent,
to
c'est
create a
plutôt
piece
une
like
œuvre
this.
d'art,
So this is more of a work of art,
en plus d'être une montre.
more than
Et
a watch.
Et puis voilà, est-ce que... Alors, ça fonctionne, parfait. Donc là, on a l'autre côté.
So here you have the other side.
Et puis... Alors, en plus de l'heure et la minute, parce que dans un
In addition to the hour and the
minutes,
minutes, in a cog you always have the same functions. Samuel mentioned it this morning. You have a power reserve, which is called the barrel, which is the same as the barrel you will find in a gun or in a rifle. So you have the reserve of energy, then you have the cog that will transfer the energy, then you have the escapement, and in this cog you define the speed at which you want the wheel to run. For instance, in order to show the minute hand is on a wheel that does 1 turn in 1 hour. And with the multiplications, you can choose this way. 1 wheel that does 1 turn in 1 hour, and then you put the minute hand on it. And with this, you can show many things, complications included. For instance, here you can show moon phases, here you can show the day of the month, and here you have a tourbillon. So that's for the first side. And on the other side, you also have a power reserve. So that's 4 complications in one mechanism, which is quite a lot.
Et alors, je vais développer un petit peu la phase de lune parce que c'est une
So
complication
I
qu'on
will
voit
speak
très
a bit
souvent.
more about moon phases because this is something that you often see and that aesthetically is quite interesting. In the discs for moon phases, as you can see, you have 2 moons. Maybe some of you have already disassembled watches. If you take out a watch, you will see that you have 2 moons rather than 1 because the time of lunation is 29.5 days. So starting with the cog, if you have a wheel that does 1 turn in 12 hours, then you can add a wheel that has the double, so you divide the speed by 2, so there will be 1 turn in 24 hours. And if you add an index on this, you can add an additional wheel that turns once per day. So lunation is 29.5 days, but you can't have a wheel that has this amount of teeth. So you will have to double the amount of teeth. And this way, we will add 2 moons. So that's a bit of a subtlety. If you disassemble a watch, you will now know why you have 2 moons instead of 1. And the tourbillon, I'm sure you've already seen watches with tourbillon, so that's a complication, the tourbillon. You can see it here on this pocket watch. You can show the side of the movement or the side of the dial, and the use of this is to make the watch more accurate. Today it's more of an aesthetic complication, something that's visual rather than something that's really useful or technically relevant. It helps offsetting deficiency. Formerly, what was used for watches wasn't too accurate, so very often the balance could be too much in advance, and also pocket watches used to be worn here or in the pocket, so they tended to be ahead of time or delayed. So to offset that, we had a mechanism to reverse the defects. So now you can still find watches with tourbillon, but it's more about the aesthetic beauty and also as a technical feat, because those are pieces that are difficult to build. You have to be very accurate. There are many components, so it's a precision work.
Et puis donc, être horloger indépendant, mais Samuel nous en parlait vraiment très bien ce matin.
Being an independent watchmaker, as Samuel said very well this morning, is a personal adventure as much as a watchmaking adventure.
C'est vraiment incroyable.
It's
Donc,
quite incredible.
à Bienne.
So my workshop is in Bienne.
Ils sont intéressés de voir plus de montres. Ils sont tout à fait les bienvenus.
If you want to see more, you're welcome to the workshop. And now I will give the floor to Théo, who will try to show the link between watchmaking and Bitcoin.
Merci. Je vais voir pour la présentation si ça se passe bien.
Let's see if the presentation works.
On a un laser? On a un laser. Parfait.
We also have a
C'est bon?
laser.
On est parti. Je regarde l'heure.
All right, let's start.
Je vais pas regarder l'heure en Bitcoin parce que j'ai envie de pas trop dépasser quand même.
I want
C'est
look
Voilà.
at the time in Bitcoin
14h18. Très bien.
because I want more than 10 minutes.
Donc
Okay.
effectivement, on va tenter de faire un lien entre
So
les
we will try
complications
to
horlogères.
show the link between watchmaking complications and Bitcoin.
Vraiment, vous le sentez bien.
So as you can see,
Et on
I'm
va notamment
starting
parler d'un
off
truc qui
well,
s'appelle
and we
les
will
UTXOs.
talk about UTXOs. The laser seems to be gone.
Voilà, c'est bon. Les UTXOs.
So
Alors, je vais me
UTXOs.
présenter un peu. Donc,
First of all,
moi,
I will
je suis,
introduce myself.
ingénieur et docteur en
I'm an
mathématiques
engineer
appliquées
and doctoral student in applied
Je suis connu sous le
mathematics.
nom de Théo
By
Pantamis.
training, I'm known as Théo Pantamis, so you can find me on Twitter with the
marqué.
@ that you can see here.
Comme Fanis, je suis
And like
développeur à
Fanis,
LN
I'm
Markets.
also a
Moi,
developer
je
at
travaille
LN
particulièrement
Markets.
sur un
I
produit
mostly
pas
work
encore
on a
lancé,
product
qui
that
s'appelle
has not
DLC
been
Markets.
launched yet, which is
S'il y a des
DLC
gens qui
Markets.
peuvent s'intéresser
If
au
some
DLC,
people
n'hésitez
are
pas à venir me
interested
voir.
in
C'est pas
DLC,
ce dont je vais parler aujourd'hui.
you can come to me,
Alors,
but this is not what I will be talking
une
about
montre,
today.
Est-ce que ça ne sert qu'à donner l'heure?
Is a watch only
Et après,
there
je pense
to
que,
give
la présentation
time?
de Shona vous a montré
I
que
think
la
that
réponse était
Shona's
évidemment
presentation showed you
Ça ne sert
that
pas qu'à
this
donner
is
l'heure.
not just
maintenant, je
for
pose la
knowing
question,
what time is it.
est-ce que Bitcoin,
So my
ça ne
question
sert qu'à
is
s'envoyer du cash électronique?
Is Bitcoin only about sending
la
electronic
réponse,
cash? And the answer is no.
Il y a d'autres applications.
There are other
Évidemment que
applications.
Bitcoin fait ça
Of
très bien,
course, Bitcoin
mais
does
il y a
this
d'autres
very well,
applications,
but there are other applications.
Parce que Bitcoin a mis en place
And because
des techniques
Bitcoin
pour résoudre,
implements
pour pouvoir permettre
techniques
justement
that
d'envoyer du cash électronique, eh bien on est capable de
allow
résoudre
us to
d'autres problèmes.
send electronic cash,
C'est ce
it's
que je vais vous
possible to
montrer.
solve other
Et je vais essayer de
problems.
vous
And
l'illustrer
that's what I will try
en
to
vous
show
montrant
and
que
illustrate, showing
une
you
chose dans
that
Bitcoin qui s'appelle les UTXOs, c'est
UTXOs
l'équivalent du
in
mouvement de base
Bitcoin
sur lequel les horlogers
are
vont construire leur computation.
equivalent
Faire
to
des
basic
genres de
movements
complications dans Bitcoin,
to
c'est
which complications
utiliser les
will be
UTXOs
added. So we can
pour
have
autre chose
complications with Bitcoin,
envoyer du cash électronique.
such as using UTXOs to do other things than
Donc,
sending electronic
pour,
cash.
Essayer de mettre de l'ordre dans tout ça,
So
on va quand même
Unpack all of this for our watchmakers. Let's try to explain what is the electronic cash that we are talking about. We like to talk about Bitcoin, super system, clock, etc. But what are Bitcoins?
Et on va même aller regarder un petit peu le contenu d'une
And we'll
UTXO.
also look at the content of a UTXO in a transaction. And then I will present some uses that appear very early in the history of Bitcoin that are a bit controversial now, but that led to true applications. And during the roundtable, we will also talk about all those parallel applications and how they can also be useful to watchmakers. And then to conclude, I have sort of a vision showing that time and Bitcoin both solve the issue of coordination in different ways. So, what is electronic cash? What is the essence of electronic cash? By essence, I do not mean a definition of what can be sent. I will try to explain what it is, what's within it. So Satoshi tries to provide a definition of electronic cash, saying an electronic cash is just a chain of digital signatures. This is on the first page of the white paper. So we define an electronic coin as a chain of digital signatures. Why did he phrase it this way? He wanted to distinguish electronic cash to the balance on an account related to a specific name. He wanted to show that it was possible to do other things than bank accounts. But unfortunately, this definition, even though it's not bad, it's not good because it mixes up what the coin is and the validity of the way it is spent. Very often you do need a signature to send Bitcoin, but it's not necessary. There is something else.
Donc on va essayer de répondre à cette
So we'll
question en
try
cadrant un peu
to
le
answer
problème.
this question by framing the issue.
Donc, si on devait dire d'une montre que c'est un bracelet pour donner l'heure,
If we said that a watch was a wristband that gives time, you will say this is a bit restrictive. We heard Shona, this is not the only function of a watch, it can do much more than that. So we could say that a watch is a portable mechanism that's regular over time that can be used to display at the time, but we could display any types of time and other information related to time. Maybe that gives a better overview of what a watch can actually do. So saying that Bitcoin is peer-to-peer electronic cash, it's good, but it can be more than that. And looking at what Bitcoin does, Satoshi identified the fact that when you want electronic cash, you need to solve an issue. The one that receives money has to make sure that the one that sends the money hasn't double spent it or double spent. So we could say that Bitcoin solved the issue of double spend, and then we don't explain what a double spend is. We try to explain it intuitively, but it's difficult to really put one's finger on the problem that we are really solving. What are we really trying to do? So this is what I will try to define in a better way. The issue is that we can't really verify that the owner hasn't double spent. So there needs to be a way to check that there is no double spend. So we want to check the absence of something. There is something that we say in science, in scientific method, saying that you can't demonstrate the absence of something. You can assume the absence, and then we will demonstrate that absence is impossible and that there is something, and then you can show that there is a difficulty. So Satoshi answers this question with this sentence that summarizes what Bitcoin does and the power of Bitcoin. The only way to confirm the absence of a transaction, so a double spend, what does this mean? We will see. So it is to be aware of all transactions. So Bitcoin is a computing protocol that helps proving the absence of certain transactions. Now, which transactions and what is a transaction that is a double spend? So in order to find out what double spend is, we need to find out what spending is. Spending what? If we assume that it's not possible for a person to create money, we should assume that what can be spent is what we have received. I still haven't said what has been received, but I can say this. What can be spent is what has been received. And often the approach is to have an account. There is this amount on the account, you can spend this amount. But this is not what we want to do. From the moment you say, I can only spend what I have received, the simplest form is there is a transaction where I reference things that I have received in the past, so bitcoins that I have received in the past, and I spend them, creating kind of a spending destination associated with an amount, and we want the amounts to be consistent with the entry amounts, and that's it. That's the simplest way of doing things, and that's exactly what Bitcoin does. This is a real Bitcoin transactions. I just hid the addresses. An input only references the destination of the previous transaction. So what you see here is a destination of the spending that could be referenced, and that could be referenced on an input to create new spending destinations. So those are what we call unspent transaction outputs. So transaction outputs that have not been spent yet. So that's what you have received. Those are transaction outputs, something that comes from a transaction.
Alors pourquoi on fait cette approche par
So
UTXO et
why
pas par
do
compte bancaire?
we use this approach with UTXOs and not with
Pas très intuitif.
bank accounts? Because it
Déjà,
doesn't
la
seem
première
very
chose, c'est que si vous
intuitive.
avez une approche par compte
The first
bancaire,
thing is that if you use the
il y a un
approach
problème,
with
c'est que, du coup,
bank
il faut que vous
accounts,
connaissiez le solde de
the
votre
issue is
compte.
that
Donc,
I
le
need to know
calculer,
the
conserver
balance
cette valeur.
of your bank account. I need to
Alors que là,
calculate it and I need to know about this
Déjà,
value.
ça fait que
But
je connais
here,
votre solde. Je sais combien d'argent vous avez.
that
Ça
means I
incite
know
à
how much money you
toujours
have.
utiliser le même compte.
So
Et
that
donc, ça a une
forces
mauvaise
you to
confidentialité.
always
Ça
use the
incite
same
à
account,
dévoiler combien
and
de
this
bitcoins
is
vous
a
avez.
confidentiality
Alors que
issue
là, j'ai
that
pas besoin. Vous
forces
voyez, là,
you
les
to show
transactions,
the amount of
je sais même
bitcoins
pas
that
qui
you
les a
have.
fait, mais
But
vous
here,
pouvez
I
tout
do
à fait
not
avoir des
know
transactions comme ça,
who made the
et elles sont
transactions,
valides.
but you can
Et,
have transactions
je
like
pense que l'argent
this,
qui
they're
est fait avant,
valid.
et c'est très bien.
Existing money is being
Et pour
spent,
vérifier
and
qu'il
this
n'y a pas de
works.
double dépense, eh bien, il suffit de
But to
vérifier
check that there is no
que,
double spend, you need to
il
check that
suffit de vérifier que l'UTXO qu'on dépense, elle n'a pas
the
déjà été
spent
dépensée. C'est-à-dire
UTXO
que
has not yet
ici,
been
ce qui fait que
spent.
la transaction 3 est valide.
Transaction 3 is valid here because there is no other transaction that spends the two previous outputs from transaction 1 and transaction 2 that are spent in transaction 3 to send
Et
money.
donc ici, si on devait
So here, if you had to
à l'heure
list,
actuelle, en l'état de s'il y avait que ces 3 transactions dans le réseau,
if there were only those 3 transactions in the network, if we had
où est le
to
cache électronique, eh bien, vous
find out
auriez
where the
la
electronic cash
sortie en
were,
haut ici, qui
you
n'est
would
pas
have
encore
the
été
output
dépensée, donc elle
on
peut
top
être
that has
dépensée.
not been spent yet, so it can be spent. So the output here, the second output of transaction 3, and the last output of transaction 2. Those transaction outputs have not been spent, so they are electronic cash that can be sent to someone. The other advantage from a purely IT point of view, using the concept of UTXO, we only say that I want a contract, so I'm creating a UTXO for this contract, and this contract will be settled once the UTXO has been spent. The consequence is that for Bitcoiners, this works well for Bitcoin because it's easier to say when shared accounts work when they are on layer 2. It's more decentralized.
Alors, que contient une UTXO après tout? Parce que là,
So what does a UTXO contain?
C'est pas vraiment ce qu'il y a à l'intérieur. Donc évidemment,
There
la
are
première chose que contient une
UTXO's outputs,
UTXO,
but we don't know what
c'est
they
un
contain.
montant.
So the UTXO contains an amount, first of all. We need to know how much Bitcoin there are in the UTXO. The other things you have in a UTXO is kind of a riddle. What you see here is a kind of riddle, and if you want to spend this unspent transaction output, you have to solve the riddle. So this riddle is kind of a piece of a program that you have to complete. The thing is that the amounts created must be less than the sum that's spent. So you can use this. And the person that needs to receive money creates a riddle that they're the only one to be able to solve, and they share it with the one that has to send the money. And the sender of the money will then find cash within the register of UTXOs that can solve the riddle because they created the riddle to receive them. And so they will build this transaction, bringing together the inputs and outputs, reference them, and he will provide outputs for this transaction, and one output will use the riddle of the recipient.
And then they solve all of the riddles, they give the answer to all of the transaction outputs, they publish it on the network, and the receiver will be paid once the confirmation is in a block. And we say the word confirmation. I'm not going to go into it because we already covered that this morning. Often the riddle is about finding a digital signature. It's a code. And often it's code that says, check that there's a valid signature. But then what's funny, and that's where you go into the bizarre applications, what's funny is you can insert anything. You don't have to put in a program. Here you have someone who did something original. They had a transaction with a lot of outputs. All of the outputs amount to 1 Satoshi individually.
Une multisignature, donc c'est-à-dire on va vouloir avoir une signature sur ces 3 clés.
And you want a signature on the 3 keys for one of these three keys, and it needs to be valid for one of the three keys.
Parce qu'en plus, on voit
It's
que
a little bit
toutes les sorties sont comme ça,
weird.
mais les clés sont différentes.
You see that
Et en
all
fait,
of the
cette
outputs are
personne, ce
like
qu'elle a fait,
this.
c'est que, à la place d'utiliser des vraies clés, des clés publiques,
What the
pour lesquelles
person
elle
did
pourrait
is, instead of
faire une
using
signature
real
numérique,
keys,
mais en fait, elle a
public
écrit des
keys
trucs
for which there
qui
could
n'ont
be
rien à voir
digital
avec des clés.
signatures,
Et elle a écrit
she
le
wrote
white paper
things
de
that
Bitcoin,
have nothing to
encodé en
do
PDF.
with
Donc, cette
keys, and
transaction,
she
dans le bloc 230
copy-pasted the
elle contient
white paper
littéralement
of
le
Bitcoin.
white paper Bitcoin. Donc souvent, c'est
So
assez
that's been
classique dans les-
encoded as a
pour les
PDF
bitcoiners
and
qui
contains
ont un nœud.
the
Il y a Bitcoin Explorer
whole
qui vous
of
permet
the
de
white
décoder en
paper
direct,
Bitcoin.
le white paper, comme ça, il vous l'affiche. C'est fait spécialement pour cette transaction. Et donc, toutes ces sorties de transactions,
And there's been
comme les clés
coding
de
just for
l'information qui a
this
été
transaction.
ajoutées comme ça et pas créées, construites mathématiquement, il n'y a pas de solution. Il y a- on peut
That's
pas résoudre
something
cette énigme,
that's
donc elles ne seront jamais dépensées.
Not
Mais les
solvable
bitcoins le savent
from a
pas.
math point of view, so it won't ever be
Et donc,
spent.
ça a créé ce type de choses,
But
ça a créé-
bitcoins don't
ça-
know
ça a créé
that.
des inquiétudes parce que
So this created
ces
concerns
sorties de transactions non dépensées, il va falloir
because
toujours les
these
surveiller. Les nœuds Bitcoin vont toujours devoir se poser la question. est-ce que
unspent
c'est un
transaction
transaction dépensée
outputs
ou pas.
will always have
Et
to
comme
be
ça va jamais être le
surveilled.
cas, ils la retiennent, ils la gardent en
They
base
won't
en
ever be
mémoire,
spent,
qu'on
which
appelle
means that the
UTXOs,
system
qui est la
needs
seule
to
chose qu'un nœud Bitcoin a
keep
besoin de
it
conserver
in memory.
pour pouvoir valider toutes les transactions futures. C'est toutes les références comme ça à des
All
sorties de
of the
transactions qui n'ont pas encore été
references
dépensées. Et il va
of
devoir à
these
jamais les retenir
unspent
parce qu'elles seront jamais
outputs
dépensées.
will have to be
Et donc,
kept
puisque
stored in memory
ces
forever
choses-là ont
because
commencé
they
à
won't
prendre de
ever be
l'ampleur,
spent.
Il y a un
And this
nouveau
phenomenon
code qui a été ajouté dans le
started
programme,
spreading.
le programme dans lequel on peut écrire des énigmes, qui s'appelle OP-Return,
A
et qui
new
permet de faire en sorte que le
system
nœud
was
Bitcoin se dit,
introduced.
ok, ce programme ne sera jamais valide, parce que OP-Return est toujours invalide.
OP
Donc
return.
cette sortie n'est pas dépensable, et donc je ne vais
OP
pas m'amuser à
return
la
is
retenir.
always invalid.
Ça, c'est un peu plus
So
propre, les nœuds Bitcoin,
this helped clear things up.
pas
Everything
retenir
after
de
it is
l'information
something
pour
that is
rien.
known as being invalid,
Et
which
du coup, il y
means
a des
that
gens qui ont commencé un peu à s'amuser,
Bitcoin
donc,
users
je vais
don't
regarder
have
si
to
vous voulez,
store
cette transaction dans le
information
bloc
for
268
nothing.
060.
So this, for example, is in the 268-060 block, and it has the lyrics of a famous song, but it has it after OP return. And you have a gray arrow which shows they can't be spent.
Et bon, comme je vous ai dit, cet usage des transactions, de mettre des messages
This
rigolos
way of
ou
using
pas,
transactions to
ben,
enter
c'est très mal vu,
funny
c'est très
or not
controversé.
necessarily funny
Donc, il y a même des
information
développeurs qui combattent ce
fuels
type de
controversy. Some miners
mais des fois, ce qui ressemble à
fight
la
against
diffusion
this
d'une
sort
information,
of
en fait, ça peut
use.
tenter d'exploiter des preuves que Bitcoin crée.
And this can be
fournir,
an
et à peu près
incentive
le seul à
to
fournir de manière
exploit
décentralisée,
proof
open source.
that
Et c'est
Bitcoin
notamment ce qu'on
can
appelle les
give
preuves
and
de
is the
vérification.
only one that can give.
Et
in
une
open
application
source.
de ces preuves, qui est
These are
relativement faible, mais qui est quand même une application, c'est que on sait que toutes les
publishing
informations qui
proof.
sont contenues dans une sortie de transaction
all the
devaient exister
information
avant
in a transaction
la création de cette sortie de
output
transaction. Donc,
need
bon,
to
entre
exist
guillemets, vous pouvez vous dire, la
before
chanson que je vous ai montrée
the
tout à l'heure,
creation
elle existe
of
depuis au moins le
its
bloc 260
transaction
40,
output.
parce que sinon ce serait jamais arrivé dans un bloc par hasard. Et donc il y a une application à ça, ce qu'on appelle le timestamping.
So there's one way to
On peut
apply
parler de
this,
ça avec
it's
Stanis,
timestamping.
si vous étiez là. Et donc l'idée, une première
Stanis
idée naïve,
spoke
c'est
about it
d'écrire
this morning.
littéralement vos documents dans la blockchain. Et puis ça
The first
prouve que les
naive
documents
idea was to
existaient avant le
write
moment où
the
ils
whole
sont
document in the
En fait, c'est
blockchain, and
vraiment
that's a
une
way
mauvaise idée,
to show
parce que ça va prendre
that
beaucoup de
it
place et
existed
c'est pas confidentiel.
before a
Tout le
certain
monde peut le
date.
document,
But
vous
the
voulez le
problem
garder
with that
secret,
is it
c'est pas une
takes up a
bonne
lot
idée.
of space
Meilleure
and
idée,
everyone can
c'est
see it,
d'écrire,
so it's not
ce que
very
j'appelle une référence.
private.
Au début, j'appelle ça des
The
références pour les
better
bitcoiners,
idea is to only
une
write a
référence,
reference. I say reference, but
le
actually
hash
is
document.
the
C'est une
H
sorte d'une empreinte cryptographique.
the hash
du document.
of the
Dans une
document,
transaction, vous écrivez cette
a
empreinte
cryptographic
toute petite,
print, in a way,
et elle fait
of
toujours
the
la taille, quelle que
document.
soit la taille du document. Donc,
And
ça
it's
prend beaucoup de
always
place. Donc, ça vous coûte pas
the
très cher,
same
en fait,
size. It always
les tailles
takes up
dépendent de la taille
as
que
much
vous
space,
écrivez.
whatever the
Mais c'est
document,
confidentiel, du coup.
because
On va
the
savoir que le
hash
document,
doesn't vary
savoir
according to the
posteriori,
volume of the
une fois que
document.
vous montrez
And
le
that
document,
way,
c'est
it
bien ce
is
document.
private.
Mais juste en voyant
So
les
you
choses, vous savez
can
pas de quel
prove that
document on
the document existed,
Et
but you
enfin, l'état
can't
de l'art
have,
aujourd'hui,
the others
c'est
don't have access
d'utiliser
to
des
what's in the
références à
document.
un ensemble de références. Ça devient un peu
And the
bizarre.
state of the art is to write a reference to a package of references.
Et donc là, il y a
It's just a simple way to phrase it, to say a package of references. And there you have no limit of size or number of documents. You end up with a very short type of data, and that's still private, still confidential.
Référence, l'ensemble des références, et c'est terminé.
And all you have to give is the references, the package of references. If you want to try for yourself, you have the website opentimestamps.org. It's free, but if you want your proof in the blockchain, you'll need to wait for a few hours, you'll have an intermediary result, and then you need to come back a few hours later.
Et c'est un service qui a été proposé par plein d'entreprises aussi.
For anyone in the blockchain to check it. Some businesses make this service easier and they complete it with a digital signature, for example, Bernstein.io, Wallet.io, and that helps give authenticity to documents. This type of timestamping is very powerful. The upscaling can be very easy and considerable. And it only...
Sauf qu'en fait, l'intérêt des UTXOs, c'est qu'on peut les dépenser quand même.
It doesn't use the protocol too much.
Détruire entre guillemets du UTXO et attacher une nouvelle chose à cette
In doing so, you destroy the UTXO and you attach something else to it later. And that's the bearer right. That's what you're using when you're using UTXO. So Bitcoin is a protocol that helps you digitalize bearer's right. What is a bearer's right? It's the bracelet you have. You don't have your name on it, but it gives you acknowledgement that you're allowed to be here because you're wearing that bracelet. So instead of a bracelet, you'd have protocols. There have already been attempts like Counterparty and Omni, and these days we have Taproot Asset and RGB. And I mention RGB because it was designed in Neuchâtel. The thing about bearer's right is it has multiple facets. Like with NFTs, it's decentralized. And here again, what we're trying to solve really is bearer's rights. There's just a little bit more complexity. As a conclusion, what's the link with watchmaking? Well, a clock wants to give you a useful and the most accurate possible indication of the time. And Bitcoin wants to give you a proof of publishing of a specific event at an approximate time. So you still have the idea of a succession of events happening. And that's what's interesting. And now we're going to have a discussion about decentralized timestamp. Christophe and Shona, please come here. Thank you.
Il arrive. Je me verse. J'ai un micro, est-ce qu'il y en aura un autre? Je te laisse commencer.
Merci, un autre micro. Merci beaucoup et désolé tout le monde pour mon français.
Thank you very much. Apologies everyone for my French.
Pour Christophe, s'il vous plaît, faites l'introduction pour
Christophe,
ton travail.
Please introduce your work and then we'll chat. I'm Christophe Sam. I'm the bad guy in the room. I know a lot of people do open source. The blockchain community is a lot about open source, but not just. I advise on intellectual property, so I advise businesses to help them protect their intellectual property. So we create patents and we help businesses validate their technology for strategies that can be about property, but also about exchange, technology transfer. And we're increasingly trying to, instead of creating silos between businesses to create bridges, legal bridges, in order to allow inventions to be transferred, for inventors to exit the proprietor mode, and to make sure that businesses can communicate more and more. It's what I found interesting when I was invited on this panel. I thought it could be interesting to see how this open source mode and the more property-oriented mode of watchmaking could cohabit and learn from each other.
Oui, est-ce qu'il y a un conflit avec patent IP ou
Is there a conflict with patent, IP, and open source?
C'est difficile peut-être pour compris open source et patent avec IP.
Because it might be difficult to understand open source. Right, when you look at the internet, sometimes you feel like there's two universes at odds. There's one that's dark, and there's the one of patents, of Microsoft, of propriety businesses that lodge patents, that have their teams of lawyers. And then you have the other world, the free world, that's trying to break free from those legalese. But the reality is much more complex, is much more nuanced. If you want to do open source and have free softwares, for example, you need IP. A free software is still a license. You still have an IT developer that created a software, that wrote code, and that tells the world you can use it, but respecting rules. Those rules are a license contract. You can freely use the software, but if you modify it, that's in the open source license. If you modify it, those modifications need to be given to the community. And it only works because it's underpinned by copyright, by IP. There's many businesses like IBM and Meredat that lodge a lot of patents to then distribute their software in open source as free softwares, and they use their copyrights to make sure that those using licenses are respected. So it's counterintuitive. But if you want to make sure that people who use your software give you their improvements, you need to make it available to them. And free softwares first developed in the software world, and that's because IP is very easily accessed with copyright without having to lodge patents. It's a little bit harder in watchmaking, where a lot of inventions need to be protected by patents, and that's difficult for small businesses.
Okay. Une question pour Théo et Christophe.
I have a question for Théo and Christophe.
Le patent Bitcoin pour faire le patent sur le blockchain et
How can Shona use the patent of Bitcoin?
Alors, je vais peut-être un peu parler de ce sujet parce que je l'ai passé rapidement dans ma présentation, mais en fait, évidemment, il faut toujours faire la distinction
briefly in my presentation.
Un système légal.
We need to distinguish between a legal system and the Bitcoin system. The Bitcoin system's philosophy is to exist outside of the state, so you can't, with Bitcoin, impose the same rules as the state can. But what you can do with Bitcoin is create proof, and then you need to get those proofs to be recognized by the state. These proofs are
timestamps.
They
prove date. It's a way to write information that can only exist because the document, like the plans or the files used for the design, existed before the confirmation of the block containing that information. We observe that, and then you can go to a lawyer and say, I can't bring the plans and all that because those folders don't go into an envelope, and that would be very costly. But you can go to them and say, I have this package of proof that can only be verified because the documents existed before a certain date. And then that person can verify that it is in the Bitcoin blockchain. And it only exists there because it existed before it was entered in that block. That's how you have an IT proof through Bitcoin that could potentially become a legal proof. The legal system is not used to that type of proof yet. It usually uses a notary.
Ça donne un élément de preuve qui après pèse dans la balance juridique.
But you have, at the end of the day, a proof that has relevance in legal terms. And that's how you can protect yourself, because you have the data in the chain in a more or less direct way. And we're trying to make this in the least direct way for it to take up less space. Shona, you might want to add something?
Merci. Oui, en effet, c'est intéressant comme
yeah, it's interesting.
Moyen, parce que
as a technique.
Horloger indépendant, bon voilà, on est tout seul, et quand on fait de la construction.
As an independent watchmaker, you work on your own. When you're building, you have few means faced with big business. When you're creating new mechanisms, I didn't know about this until today, but I am intrigued.
Est-ce que c'est pratique pour vous?
Is it practical for you?
Alors, comme Théo me l'a présenté juste avant, oui, en effet, ça semble.
Well, the way Théo explained it, I think it would be.
Dans nos logiciels, mais qui sont assez lourds et assez coûteux.
We have means in our software, but they're cumbersome and costly, and they're used in big business.
Peut-être pour illustrer par une anecdote.
I could illustrate with an anecdote.
Beaucoup d'entre vous la chanson Stairways to Heaven.
Many of you know Led Zeppelin's song Stairway to Heaven.
1971.
It was written in 1971. It was a huge global success. Top one for a whole year.
Au moment où ce morceau a été écrit, il y avait un autre groupe qui jouait dans le studio.
And when that was written, there was another group in the studio, and they created a song with exactly the same notes, same intro, and the lyrics even resembled those of Stairway to Heaven. And there were contentious procedures to see if they had copied it.
Ou si c'était le contraire.
And to see who might have copied whom. Was it maybe the now unknown group that had created it? And some of these procedures have not even reached their completion. In some countries, they're ongoing. In other countries, there was a settlement, or in some countries, even it's the other group that won. And it's very complicated once the song has been recorded, because you have a few months before it's published, even more months before it becomes a success, and then it's very difficult to know who first wrote it. And it might have been a matter of hours or days. And 50 years on, it's almost impossible for courts to decide. It's he said, she said. You have to take the word of one against the other. But this is always how it's been for IP. It's about dating, whether it's for music, softwares, inventions.
For patents, at the end of the day, it's about who did it first, who wrote the song first. And when there is a contentious procedure, a dispute, you have to prove that you had the document before the other. Until now, the solution was to go to the notary. That's still an option if it's not too expensive. If you're writing what could be the new Harry Potter, please go to the notary and register it. You'll have a proof. It will cost you a few hundreds of francs. It's worth it. But if you're in a world where innovations move very fast, if you are a journalist and every day you write something, or if you're a musician who composes every day, if you're an IT developer who's coding every day, you're not going to go to the notary every day and record it. Even big companies don't do it. With Bitcoin's timestamps, you have this virtual notary that supports you, and every time you have a creation, it creates a certain date. This verified timestamp, you keep it, and if there ever is a dispute, and we're not wishing that on you, you have the proof that helps you not have to go to the court, because you don't want the dispute to gain traction. This way you're able to say, I had it 3 days before you, you didn't date it, and this is a great way to avoid disputes from snowballing. It creates something much more solid. We've been creating it since 2017. It's not completely new, but it's still being developed. And it's about educating businesses and users too. We need to teach them to trust that system. It's going to take a few years for businesses to start using it. Many businesses are taking it on. Businesses which until now didn't necessarily use IP. It could be independent entrepreneurs like Shona. It's really difficult to have patents for everything when you're a small structure. This is also useful for architects. There can be disputes between architects because you might go to one and then he gives you plans, but you stop trusting that architect, you go to another one, and a year or two later, the house is built, and then you have elements from the plans of the first architect that end up in the plans of the house, and this is the kind of dispute that we see a lot in Switzerland and in other countries. It's really difficult to settle, because journalists, architects are professions that don't have very reliable systems for this. So timestamps are a very credible solution to make IP accessible at a low cost for professionals who until now weren't using IP very much. What's the difference between timestamp, NFTs, rules, ordinal, inscription? Right, well, you said a lot of terms. That's what I was looking at the beginning of my presentation. NFTs are more about a bearer's right. Those who don't know NFTs just know that it's when we assign digital work of art to an owner. And when you assign it to an owner, you want to help that owner be able to sell it. So it's a living thing. It's not set in time, and you need to prove that the owner changed. If all you do is timestamp an owner, they can always prove that they're still the owner. It doesn't give you what's needed to prove that it's changed hands. So it's still the problem of the double spending.
ce qu'on veut, il va falloir qu'il
whether it's Bitcoin or another item that changed hands, you need something to guarantee that the former owner isn't still claiming to be the owner. That's what you get with Bitcoin and other blockchains. All blockchains need to solve this. That's not what a timestamp achieves. All a timestamp does is say that that document existed before that date. It doesn't say the document is authentic. It doesn't say whose it is. It just says that it existed before that date. That's why the timestamp usually comes with a signature to say, I'm the person who signed it. And I timestamped my signature on that document, so I couldn't have produced the signature if I didn't have that document at that time, and if I hadn't produced it. So I created a claim by signing that document, a claim that I am the author, and then it's up to the other party in the dispute to produce a similar proof that they also have a signature of that document but before you did. And that's why it's difficult to go to the root of the story. It's hard to prove that there weren't other proofs of the document existing before. So what a timestamp does is set something in time to prove it was there, but it doesn't help you trace back the chain of ownership, while NFTs and runes help you trace ownership. And you have transcriptions. That's ordinal. That is linked to ownership chains. But what they are is a technique to write data into Bitcoin blockchain. The examples I showed you had data written into the outputs of transactions. And in the case of transaction, we write it into the entries, the inputs. They're entered with riddles that need answers that are going to help encode it. And that's how, at the beginning of last year, in 2023, we started seeing something that gained a lot of traction. But writing data into the entry wasn't originally interesting. It became so as an optimization of the operational costs of the protocol. But this is in the great system of ordinals, which assigns where satoshis go in the transactions. When I showed you transactions, I said the only condition is that the sum of outputs be inferior to the sum of inputs. And we like to see things as coins that, but really the coin has been destroyed and then recreated. So the theory of ordinals arbitrarily and separately from the protocol helps us say that the coin here went to that output there. It does it arbitrarily, so we design transactions to play on ownership by organizing transaction outputs in a certain order. So it's kind of a tactic to say that what I inscribed here is now belongs to that output there. And that's how you trace ownership in ordinals. It's a theory that has cons and pros, but at least it's simple.
Merci. Alors, est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
Thank you. Are there questions in the room?
Ou pas? No, d'accord.
No questions. You understood everything.
C'est compliqué, hein?
Shona, it's quite complicated.
Très compliqué pour si vous débutons par exemple.
For
donc,
someone who doesn't know about the topic.
Est-ce que vous avez des questions pour
Do you have questions
les gars,
for those two guys?
Solution pour après tu as
Maybe
fait
about finding a solution after you have made a piece.
C'est vrai que C'est un sujet qui a
It is a topic that is interesting, that was also interesting years ago when we are working on the restoration of former pieces, 200, 300-year-old clocks. We always see the signature of the clockmaker who manufactured it or repaired it, and in Neuchâtel, when we look at some pieces and when we look at the back of the clock, we can see the engravings that show all the clockmakers that built or repaired the piece. So this is something that's very, very topical even today, and it's really good to mention the means that we have today to do those things.
Qui peut aider Shona si elle a besoin de...
Who could help Shona in case she needs any support?
Je pense pour les personnes qui sont intéressées
For those who are interested in having an idea of how those things work, I mentioned opentimestamps.org. The advantage of this platform is that it is free to use. It's not the most practical, but it is free, so that's already something. So if you want to try and use it, you can go on this website. If you are scared about the secrets that you want to timestamp, maybe try to first familiarize yourself with the system using things such as photos or notes, something that is not too valuable to you, just to reassure yourself, even though I know that there will be no information leaked to the Open Timestamps website. So on opentimestamps.org, when you go on the website, you will see a little sign that shows drag and drop, so you can just drop a file in a little box, and so the website will compute the digital footprint of the file, which will be sent to calendar servers that will temporarily keep this information. They will wait until a certain amount of people want to timestamp, and after a certain period considered reasonable, all the footprints of those documents will be taken, and then there will be this list of references that will be drawn up. All those references will be put together, and there will be a footprint of the footprints that will be calculated, and this will be put in an op return output that I showed you earlier. This will be included in a transaction, and once this is done, unfortunately you don't know when exactly it will happen, but once it is done, you can go back to the website, you can put your file there again, so when you added your file, another file was returned to you, a small file with information on what you timestamped so that you can find it on the server. So you put this small file back into the server, and then you're asked to put the original document. But it's important that you have not modified this initial file. If you modify the document, you will have to create a new one. You cannot save your modifications on the initial file, because the idea is to make sure that it is exactly the same file that was put there initially. So you have to put the exact same file, and then the platform will produce a new file saying, this is your timestamp, it is in this block. And later on, when you want to prove to someone that this file that you created existed before a certain date, you just have to go on the website, put back this second small file that you received, and then the original file, and this will tell you, yes, indeed, it is indeed in this block. You will say it's the website that says that, but you can check this for yourself. For those who are running a Bitcoin node, you can also use the Python OTS program, and manually on your computer you can connect OTS to your node, indicate the RPC code, and then you can check yourself that it is indeed in this block of the blockchain that there is a timestamp of your document. And then you will see that indeed your file is there. There was no connection to the internet, there was just a connection to your node. So it's not just a website that tells you all good. There is a real verification process, and it actually happens on your computer. So it's good to familiarize yourself with this. To me, it seems simple, but I understand if it's not simple to everyone. So it's something to really get acquainted with. There is a question of culture and habit, but once you're used to using that, it doesn't take much time to say, okay, I will put my file on the website, I have my little proof, and I will check the next day if it is indeed in the blockchain, and then I have an element of proof that will allow me at any point to say that my file existed before a certain date. That's why it's also interesting to have support solutions. One could say that it's not because the file existed before a certain date that you're the author of this file. It's quite a daring thing to say, but you never know. When you have this kind of issue, this can happen. So it would be good in maybe the designing tools that you have. Maybe there are ways to have digital signatures to be included in the file that kind of strengthens your argument. Because if there is a signature, it would be difficult to say that you are not the creator, because that means you can then break cryptography. So it's more difficult. So I believe there is a lot of habit there as well. Thank you. And I believe that what you said, Shona, is very interesting. We are here to talk about bridges that can be created between those two worlds, very related to Neuchâtel, but that are not really are connected to each other, crypto and watchmaking. So timestamping is a first avenue to address a concern that you mentioned, Shona. When you work with brands and you want to present documents, it can be challenging. You have to have a certain degree of trust. So very often you are reluctant to share your plans. You don't want to show too much. You have to sign confidentiality agreements. So sometimes we tend to keep secrets internally rather than presenting them. And that's a shame, because you tend to lose sometimes collaboration opportunities. But timestamping offers you a level of protection that allows you to exchange documents in a safer way, without any fear of having those data stolen or any information stolen, and you are in a legally stronger position faced with stronger actors. On the issue of traceability and signature in Neuchâtel clocks, this is also something that's realistic. There is a real issue for clockmakers to trace warranty certificates. You can have a warranty for your luxury watch, which is in a paper format in countries like Georgia. In other countries, they are there is forgery of certificates, and so there are real watches, but often there is a false warranty certificate. So a watch will have a certificate that said that it was sold 6 months ago, even though it was sold 10 years ago. So it's very difficult to control that. The blockchain technology is more adequate than a paper certificate to have a register of sales and a register of repairs in a secure way. And these are not too complicated technologies. If you put this into place with open source tools, it can be a bit more complicated, but there are also commercial companies that can make things easier and that can allow them to have timestamping in a way that's easy as putting a file in Dropbox, and that helps you store data, documents, even warranty documents, without needing a sophisticated IT system.
Shona, pourquoi horologie?
Shona,
comment tu as trouvé cette profession?
Why watchmaking? How did you end up in this area? That's a big question.
C'était en voyant l'horloge astronomique de Prague.
It was when I saw the astronomical clock in Prague. I was very young. I found it very big, very colorful. There are all the zodiac signs on it. I was 10 years old, and I promised myself that one day I will try and understand how this works. So when I reached 15 years old, when I could start studying watchmaking, I went into this direction. So it's been 11 years now that I'm in the field.
Alors, l'année prochaine, vous avez besoin de visiter BTC Prague.
Next year, you need to see BTC Prague for the great Bitcoin conference.
Ça marche.
Ouais.
Okay, deal.
OK, question.
Questions, please.
Ouais, monsieur, merci beaucoup.
Thank you, sir.
Un moment.
Just one moment, please.
Oh oui, merci.
C'est qui? Levez la main.
Moi, j'avais une petite question pour...
Just one question for Panta. I didn't understand the link between the complications of clock and the complications of Bitcoin that you mentioned. It's kind of an analogy. It has its limits, of course.
Parce qu'en fait, les complications
Complications, I believe Shona explained to us that the same basic movement is used, a spring that delivers energy going through a watch train. So I will not step in an area that is not my specialty. But if you look at the applications that we've been discussing, they need a register, a ledger that is open, that is available, that can be verified, and that helps doing what Bitcoin does. Now, the things that you do with those applications do not necessarily leverage all the strength of the proof provided by Bitcoin, but you can have a very important scale-up in exchange. So I see this as complications because Bitcoin initially is for payments. Let's still remember that. And here this is not about payment. We haven't been talking about payments in this roundtable. And yet, we're still doing this through Bitcoin. So I see this as a complication. It relies on the same basis, the same technical basis, from a protocol point of view as well. Miners will be mining, creating proofs of publication, and this will help creating timestamps, etc. And even though it is not about payments, it is done thanks to Bitcoin, and it is open source and verifiable thanks to Bitcoin, and that's why you have those notary services that could not be imagined before, and that's why I see this as complications, because it's based on the same mechanics, the same protocols, and helps achieving a result that is not necessarily related to the initial purpose of Bitcoin. Then there are many debates, and I talked about controversial topics, about what people were saying about UTXOs. It's a whole debate because our resources are limited. What Bitcoin helps us understand is that our resources to synchronize, well, the amount of data that can be synchronized, coordinated, is quite limited. So this is kind of a physical limitation. It's a bit metaphysical here. There is a certain amount of data that can be synchronized. But all applications compete with each other. So there will also be kind of a balance of power between those who want to do timestamping, those who want to do pure data writing, maybe with the ordinals, with the inscriptions and all the controversy that goes with it. But yeah, those are complications, but let's see if the system can manage it. And as you said, once you start building on top of Bitcoin, you can be considered as a complication. So anything that's related to L2 and above, this is also something that you can associate or consider as a complication. Yes, indeed, it can be considered as a complication, but then it's also about semantics. I can't say that Lightning Network is a complication because the Lightning Network is different, and Bitcoin is for payment. It's as if I said there's the new way of displaying the hour, but it's different. But maybe moon phases are a way of showing time passing. Yes, there is something poetic about it. It's also about showing the passage of time, but it's also astrophysical phenomenon, so it is also about some events. And in Bitcoin, timestamping is also about showing some events. And that's why I draw this parallel between with UTXOs, but of course there are some limits. If, for instance, if we wanted to add a shade of grey to my metaphor, there are techniques that do not require any up return. You can inscribe data that can be spent, but the data still remains in the chain, in the block, so you still have the proof that corresponds, and it's still possible to show proof that the data was inscribed, even though there was payment at the same time as data was inscribed. So this adds a new shade to what I just said, because you have payment, so it's not a complication. Intrinsically, the same thing is happening from a technical point of view, but we also used that payment to do something else. So we're kind of in a gray area, and it's difficult to answer the question in a very clearly. So of course there are some limits to my analogy. But I wanted to create cases where you could clearly draw this parallel between complications and UTXOs.
Merci.
Thank you.
Merci.
Thank you.
J'ai une question un peu naïve peut-être.
I have a bit of a naive question maybe.
Familiarisation à Bitcoin.
In the time where I familiarized with Bitcoin, I understood that talking about the blockchain tended to irritate sometimes. So, Théo, when you hear about bringing together two universes, here bringing together watchmaking and blockchain, do you think that it is a kind of a shortcut, or this is just something too easy, or
c'est évidemment une question de sémantique.
Do you think this doesn't make sense? Of course it is about semantics. I like to say that what we want to use is Bitcoin. To me, blockchain is not something like an originality of Bitcoin.
Dans les années 90.
Blockchain is related to timestamping unit in the 90s. So you can have, well, the issue of blockchain is that it is used to refer to networks, to protocols, even though the essence of blockchain, just like the essence of electronic data, is a chain of blocks, which is a bit weird. I like to say, or the terminology that I would use, is that Bitcoin allows timestamping. Now, I understand that people are interested in other cryptocurrencies, so they try to make sense of the fact that there is some intersection between what they do and Bitcoin is not the only blockchain used for timestamping, but it is the most robust one, and so that's where the timestamps will be the most valuable. So that's why we talk about this here. So I prefer talking about the Bitcoin protocol because I believe that Bitcoin is the best blockchain. That's the blockchain that does its job the best, which is to prove double spend, or the absence of double spend rather, which is the easiest to use, the easiest to verify. And this is important because the time to verify proof in cryptography, that was always something important. You always need to check, verify something as quickly as possible. And so, from a cryptography point of view, we go hard and we validate all transactions, and that's only this way that we will be sure that this has been verified. So, Bitcoin is what provides the most proof with the lowest validation costs, considering the robustness of the proof. So this is, I'm saying that this is the best technology. Others then used a term to try and experiment based on what Bitcoin does, but in a different way. No, they're trying to do what Bitcoin does, but the protocol that does what Bitcoin does the best is Bitcoin. So that's why I like to talk about Bitcoin. The others, if they want to use blockchain, I understand what they mean. I know they don't only talk about the database, they talk about a network, a coordination protocol. But to me, the best coordination protocol is Bitcoin.
Christophe, est-ce qu'il y a des informations pratiques pour
are there practical information that can be provided to someone like Shona on the patent, copyright system and intellectual property?
Bon, je pense que pour
I believe that for a small business for now, we hope that it will become bigger. I believe that the IP risks are those that were mentioned. So the risk of technology theft, and technology theft is usually not linked to hackers entering your IT system. It can happen, but very often this is through discussions with partners, discussions with subcontractors or brands that you collaborate with and that may think that what you build is very good, and they might draw inspiration a bit quickly to do things that look like what you do, and it would be good for you not to have any regrets. If you have a good design, if you have a kind of a build that is unprecedented, it would not be good if you cannot defend yourself faced with the competition. So it's a good precaution to date documents and to find out if technologies are new or if there is a design that is quite new and that will be at the heart of the DNA of the watches that you build. It would be good to identify this early to see if you need to protect what you're doing either through a drawing or a model or a patent. It's hard sometimes to know where to find the right limit. Some designers tend to be too modest. This is also part of the region's DNA. Many designers are too modest and think that what they're doing is not big enough. But it's good to explain that you don't need to be a Nobel Prize winner to have a patent, but it doesn't mean that you can patent everything. So you need to be able to sense that you are building or creating something really new that has real value added, that can have value for the next few years. It would be good to identify this and tell yourself, okay, maybe I have something here. I will start by time-stamping this and see if I need a protection strategy in order to avoid having any regrets later.
Alors c'est juste.
This is true.
C'est vrai que en fait quand on est.
And it's true that when you are alone, when you do everything yourself, those are questions that seem very abstract. But it's very good to talk about this. It's very well said. But it is true that when you're in your workshop, when you're behind your machines, those are completely different universes, different professions.
Alors, Shona, bienvenue à Bitcoin
So, Shona, welcome to the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And sorry, Christophe, how did you find out about Bitcoin? You mean this event or the technology? How I discovered it? Well, I was trained as an engineer in electronics, and I mostly worked on software. And in our work, we meet really creative people, also people who filed patent or who were asking questions about patenting. So very often, very quickly, we ended up in this area. And we also work with a partner. We've been working with this partner for 10 years on time stamping. So we were early adopters of the technology. Yes, me again. As a historian and as a watch lover, I listened with great interest to everything that was said. You talked about the Prague clock, and I saw the Strasbourg clock, and that's also when I asked myself many questions. I listened with a lot of interest, but also with a lot of doubt. you mentioned those clocks that can be opened and where your signatures, the signatures of those who manufactured or those who repaired, or false signatures. I showed this morning the signature of Breguet, but clockmakers in Paris were making Swiss watches and then had them signed again in Paris. So very often the historian or the historian is often a judge, can say, yes, you can see the name Fabien on it, but what does it prove? And also, you said that it was more of a proof of timestamping more than a proof of propriety. But from a scientific point of view, when you're part of a community of know-how, saying that I had an idea, I patented it, who is the I? Once you've decided to patent something, you know that this idea, you didn't have it yourself. You mentioned an architect earlier. I was interested because I had the same problem. The architect can give their plans to someone, this person give them to another architect, and then we can see common elements. Well, that's the zeitgeist. You can see designers that recreate hotels. It's always about Philip Stark's designs. Who copied who? In a community of craftspeople, there are ideas, but they are patented by the first person who thought about patenting it. That's what the judge could think, at least. Thank you for this comment. It is true. I never filed for a patent, and you may have noticed that I'm not very comfortable on stages. I'm more comfortable in the workshop. I'm so uncomfortable that I forgot to present my brand, but my brand is called Chemea, which means alchemy in ancient Greek. Chemeia is actually the real term. There's an I between the E and the A. And in my watch, I don't directly sign with my name, but with the name of this brand for two reasons. Because for me, a watch is the alchemy of all those neutral components that when you bring them together create this beating heart. That's the balance that starts moving, and I find that magnificent. So Chemea was about this alchemy of components, but also about the alchemy of all people who work on creating this piece, which is a work of art in my view. In my watch, I build most of the components when I have the machines, but for everything that is about the casing, so the dial, the watch case, the hands, the wristband, I don't build those. I work with artists, and I ask that each of these artists sign. So the dial is signed by the person that make it because they use techniques that are handmade. And personally, I put my name in the movement, but you really need to remove some components to see my signature because I didn't want to highlight this. Well, I'm an independent watchmaker, so I am alone in the structure, but I'm not the only person that creates the watch. And this morning we talked about it with Samuel and Watchmakers United. We are all well connected, and when someone has a problem, very often we can call each other, discuss, find solutions. And it is true that personally, and maybe this goes against the grain, but I wouldn't want to publish or have a patent. I would rather discuss and show pictures of what I'm doing on social media. And maybe this is proof so that someone cannot just say that they own this idea. There are very beautiful quotes on the strength of ideas. And there have been across time. So thank you very much for this comment. On the 2 points that you mentioned, for the first point, you are completely right. Timestamping an idea does not necessarily mean that you were the first one to have this idea. You can prove that you had this idea at that time, but we won't be able to trace everything in your brain to see if this idea came from you. In many disputes, you will have some strength if you can prove to the judge that this idea, this solution, this plan, you had it before an important meeting where the minutes were time-stamped and show that some plans were presented, and then you know that the plans had a date that was before the meeting. So by referring to the same plans, there is a chain of proof that becomes more and more plausible for the judge. So you don't necessarily go all the way back to the person who had the idea, but you can say that at that point, I shared a piece of information under a confidentiality agreement to another company, and this company was clumsy in using it, did something else with my invention, filed for a patent, and then you end up in a situation that is easier before a judge than when you have no proof and it becomes a he said, she said situation. So this does not work in all cases. Sometimes it's difficult to know this. You stole this idea yourself from someone else, but it helps going a bit further back in the chain of proof, and very often there will be a missing link.
Now about the other question, that of knowing what an invention really is, well, everything is iterative. Of course, with most creations, we're not actually inventing physics concepts. There's a huge amount of patents being filed for every year, but it all relies on existing laws that we're using. And it's not enough to be new. You need to show that there was a certain difficulty. Tourbillons have existed for a while, but one day someone said it would be great if the spiral could spin on an axis. Well, it's great that they do, but I'm going to do something different with a double tourbillon, triple tourbillon with one axis, two axes. And at the patent office, the role of the examiner is to say, is it really new to have two axes, three axes? Is it something that's difficult to obtain, or is it something that's unheard of? If you are able to prove that single axis tourbillons have been in existence for 600 years, and to prove that no one had thought of using different axes to do without gravity whatever the position of the watch, you'll be able to show that you were able to overcome a difficulty that generations before you weren't able to overcome. Anytime we file for a patent, we have to go through this to wonder whether it's a logical evolution, whether we're using old codes without barely changing them. Is there sufficient criteria being met for the patent? You really need more than just something new. You need to be able to prove that the new thing was not obvious for the artisan. And there's a huge amount of case law that you need to go through and overcome to deserve your patent.
Alors, c'est fini. Donc, merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup.
We've reached the end. Thank you, everyone.
Oui, mesdames, monsieur, merci. Merci, Nico.
Thank you.
Merci.
Tout le monde est installé? Voilà. Donc, voilà, je me présente, je m'appelle Nicolas, je suis dans l'organisation.
Everyone's taken a seat. My name is Nicholas. I'm part of the organization of the event. And I'm also trying to bring Bitcoin to remote areas, for example, in rural areas where no one's heard of it. And you really need to make it simple for people.
Tout ce qu'on a déjà évoqué, s'il n'est pas à l'heure.
And it's high time, with everything we said. If it's not high time, then we missed something. It's high time to speak of the origins of watchmaking value, and to draw a link with Bitcoin's value. Because I go to those remote places in France, and that's a question I hear a lot. Where does the value of Bitcoin come from? Very often people think it's purely a value derived from speculation, from trading, but we're going to look at it today and realize that's maybe not the case. And since we're courteous, we're going to first give the floor to a watchmaker. Marco Tedeschi brought us absolutely unique pieces that are available here. They're exclusively for Bitcoin. And he's going to speak about the value in the watchmaking industry.
Merci, Nico. Bonjour à tous.
Thanks, Nico.
Tout d'abord, j'aimerais remercier
Hello, everyone.
Bitcoin de m'avoir
First of all, I'd like to thank the Bitcoin Paradigm for the invitation, and I'd like to thank Watchmakers United. They represent us.
Au premier étage. Ce panel, il est très intéressant.
Thank you for helping us showcase our creations on the first floor.
Dans l'horlogerie, on va voir qu'il y a
We're going to be speaking about value. In watchmaking, there's many ways to define value. I'm going to try to briefly present Kross Studio, because I'm also here to sell my brand.
Différentes choses qui définissent la valeur.
And then we're going to run through a few defining factors of value and ways to express it. Kross Studio is a brand I created in 2020 with 4 partners. We're all involved in the business. I'm in charge of the general direction and creation. And each one of us is an expert in their field. What's special about us is we created this to create watches, but not traditional watches. We wanted to go beyond what we know as traditional watchmaking. And we're selling a bit more than just watches. In fact, we've only been selling watches for watches the last year. We work on collections with brands, like we've worked with Disney about the universe of Star Wars, or we've worked with Warner Brothers. We explore universes that bring our users and fans to places that traditional watchmaking doesn't usually bring them to. We also try to make more affordable products with accessories, but still it's not for everyone's budget. The entry-level budget is 68,000 euros. And I'm going to explain this a little bit, how we get to those prices. The concept of our watches is based on an innovative idea. It's a very simple, very clean product. I wanted something that didn't have crowns, nothing pointy, easy to wear, and it's a base that can be adapted with many different versions. The tourbillon was created by Louis-Abraham Breguet. It's a complication that's very visual, so people like it. And we wanted to put the tourbillon at the heart of the watch. It's centered, but not only that. It's also elevated compared to the rest of the movement, so you can really see the beating heart of the watch at the center of the movement. And of course, you can see that for yourself by going to the first floor. We have these is collaborations. And the idea is not just to have a watch with a logo on it. Many have done that, including for entry-level watches and for luxury watches too. The idea of collaborations was more to draw inspiration from rich universes. This is a Batman example. There's a strong visual identity.
Et l'idée, c'est de s'imaginer
si on était
l'horloger de Batman ou l'horloger de Dark Vador.
We ask ourselves if we were Batman or Darth Vader's watchmaker, what would we create?
Les plus grandes sociétés de l'entertainment.
We've worked with the biggest companies in entertainment like Disney, Warner Brothers, Hasbro, and Ubisoft. That's in the field of video games. It's a new collaboration. We don't have a product yet, but we'll be announcing it shortly. Here you have a recap of our collector sets. The first one above, the Death Star collector set. One piece comes from the movie. We call it Ultimate Collector Set because you get the watch, but you also get a piece from the movie. It's a 10 pieces limited edition.
L'autre produit qu'on vous a amené aujourd'hui, c'est une autre pièce Star Wars qui est aussi, elle, assez imposante.
Then you have a Star Wars piece.
De Lucasfilm.
We worked with the Lucasfilms model makers to create a limited series that reproduces the Boba Fett vessel. And it was created on the model that was used to film the Empire
de sociétés d'ailleurs de la Chaux-de-Fonds qui ont collaboré à la réalisation de ce produit. L'idée étant de reprendre l'iconique Batmobile de Tim Burton.
We used Tim Burton's iconic Batmobile and we integrated mechanical movement with 30 days power reserve, which is much more than what you usually have on the market, where it's 8 to 10 days. And here you had the pockets for traveling.
Pour parler de valeur, j'ai souhaité distinguer la valeur de deux manières. Premièrement,
now, coming to the idea of value, I wanted to look at two aspects, the objective and the subjective value. So the objective is the sale price of your product, the quality of materials. Scarcity also defines it.
Une manufacture qui produit des petites séries de 10, 20
a production line that creates small series of 10 or 20 pieces cannot sell as much as an industrial operation that sells tens of thousands of watches. And there's usefulness too. All watches aren't equal. When we spoke of complications, we showed that the more functionalities you want, the more value there is, the more it costs, because it requires time and materials. And then there's the subjective value, which is what you're able, what you want to spend, what you'd be ready to spend for it. First of all, the aesthetics. Some love a brand and they really like something ostentatious, while others might want something more discreet. Then there's the emotional attachment. It's something we hear a lot. Personally, I have pieces in my collection that I attach a lot of emotional value to. They might not be the most expensive ones, but they're linked to an event, an important event in my personal life, and as such, they bear value for me. And then the third category
la montre aujourd'hui, la montre
the cultural and social
elle vous sert pas
standing.
à donner l'heure. Évidemment, elle donne l'heure, mais ça va bien au-delà
A watch
de la
isn't
simple
just to
lecture
tell
de l'heure.
time.
Je vous propose un très bref rappel de l'histoire
Very
horlogère, de la
briefly,
manière dont on
a
a
recap
produit des
of
montres.
the history of watchmaking and of
L'horlogerie mécanique traditionnelle,
the
elle est née
process.
au XVIe siècle.
The traditional mechanical
Avec
watchmaking
le temps,
industry
on a connu
appeared in the
les
16th
horlogers,
century.
dans les fermes de la région,
Watchmakers in farms in the region
qui ne pouvaient pas travailler
were
l'hiver à
actually
cause de la neige,
farmers,
du coup,
and they
faisaient
weren't
de
able to
l'horlogerie.
work in the winter
Puis on a eu
because of
la
snow,
révolution
so
industrielle, la
they
construction des
started making
premières
watches.
grandes usines
Then,
à
with the
Fontaine-Melon,
Industrial
avec
Revolution, we
différents
had the first
et finalement,
factories,
les innovations modernes qui permettent aujourd'hui à des
all the way
sociétés
to modern innovations today,
de produire des
through
énormes
which
quantités de
industrial
montres avec
societies
une
were able to
qualité
produce
impeccable,
huge quantities of
dans
watches
des délais
of
battant toute
perfect
concurrence.
quality
Mais
and
c'est
in
pas
record
tout.
time.
C'est pas tout parce qu'à côté de ça et de
But that's not
l'horlogerie
all.
industrielle, il y a aussi les horlogers indépendants, dont on fait
Alongside
partie, qui soient seuls derrière leur
industrial
établi, à leur
watchmaking, you
domicile
have
ou en petites
independent
équipes,
watchmakers, us.
dans des
We're in
micro-manufactures
workshops,
verticalisées.
in small
Eh bien,
teams,
la manière de
in
fabriquer
verticalized
va être
microplants.
totalement différente. Si on
And the
prend
way
ici
we
l'usine,
make
je pense
watches
que
is
là, c'est
completely
chez
different.
Bulgarie, où ils font des
The
milliers de
plant
montres,
you see here
alors
is a
que quand on a une production
Bulgari
de 10
factory.
pièces, évidemment, les enjeux ne sont pas les
When we
mêmes.
produce
les
only
moyens
10
de fabrication
pieces,
sont pas les mêmes,
obviously
et
the
à la
means
fin,
of production
la valeur
aren't the
n'est
same,
pas la même.
and the value at the end of the line isn't the
Une autre
same.
manière de créer des différenciations
Another
en termes
way
de valeur, c'est la
to
valeur
create
de statut.
different
C'est
types of
l'importance
value
culturelle qu'on
is
attache
the
aux
statute.
montres. Il y a les
The
montres de
cultural
statut, les montres de prestige.
importance we attach to watches. We have Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, Breguet. These watches are known for their classical style
On a les montres
and very
qu'on peut
prestigious
qualifier
connotations.
de professionnels, c'est d'ailleurs comme ça qu'on le nomme dans le
You also have
cadre Rolex, qui sont
so-called
liés à des
professional
défis
watches,
techniques, à l'innovation,
like
qui
Rolex.
permettent de réaliser
They're
des
linked
tâches,
to
au niveau
technical
professionnel.
challenges, to
Et on a finalement
innovation.
l'influence
They
de la mode et
help
du
us carry
design.
out
J'ai pris ici
tasks in the
l'exemple
professional
de Chanel
setting.
avec la J12.
And then you have
Voilà.
fashion. I took the example of Chanel's G12.
Les facteurs qui font la valeur dans une montre, ils sont nombreux. On va voir
The
maintenant
factors
différents
that
axes,
determine the
ces
value
différents
of
facteurs.
watches
On a
are
tout d'abord le côté artisanal
numerous.
et le côté expertise. Donc c'est la
You
la
have the
méticulosité du travail
artisanal
manuel,
side, the
c'est le fait
expertise,
de
so
terminer
how
ses pièces à la main,
meticulous the
c'est le
manual
fait de
work
faire
is.
un anglage à la main,
This
un poli
is
à la main qui peut
linked
prendre
to
plusieurs
someone
heures, plusieurs jours
handworking
par
a
composant.
finish.
On a le savoir-faire des horlogers,
Something that can
puisqu'il
take
ne suffit pas de bien savoir
few
terminer ses
days.
pièces, mais dans certains mécanismes, et spécialement quand on parle d'horlogerie indépendante,
And
ou
in
de
some
petite série,
mechanisms,
le travail et le
in
savoir-faire
independent
de
watchmaking and
l'horloger
reduced
est
series,
prépondérant, puisque
the watchmaker plays a huge role.
La plus compliquée du monde, qui est la
That's
grande
the example of the most complicated watch in the world.
Il y a que deux
The
horlogers,
great
je crois,
complication
qui
of
sont
Vacheron
capables de la
Constantin.
monter
I
et
think
qui en
only
plus travaillent
2
en binôme,
watchmakers are
pour
able
la
to
réaliser,
assemble
parce
it,
qu'un
and they
seul
have to
ne
work
suffirait pas.
together
Donc là, on est vraiment sur les, je dirais,
because one
les
alone
niveaux
can't do it.
les plus incroyables.
So we're reaching
Et puis il y a aussi toutes les autres techniques
in the
annexes,
industry.
parce que finalement l'horlogerie c'est pas que des horlogers,
And then you have all
c'est des tas de métiers.
annex
J'ai
techniques.
pris ici un
Watchmaking
exemple de
brings in
l'émaillage,
lots
donc la
of different
peinture
expertises, not
émail
just
sur cadran. Mais il y en
watchmakers.
a
So
plein d'autres. Il y a les
you have, for
guillocheurs, il y a
example,
les marketeurs, enfin, il y en a
enamel
des dizaines.
painting.
Et tout ça finalement, ça vient d'un savoir-faire manuel, artisanal. Et
All of which
c'est
is
une part
derived
prépondérante
from
de la valeur de la pièce.
handmade artisan
Ensuite, il y en a un autre
craftsmanship.
facteur qui est en soi assez similaire, c'est la rareté et l'exclusivité.
Then
J'ai
there's
pris deux
another
exemples
factor,
ici. Le
scarcity,
premier, c'est une
exclusivity.
montre, une pièce unique.
The first example is a unique piece that was entirely made by hand by Philippe Dufour. So
Quelle est la
There's
valeur
only
d'une
one.
pièce unique de cet ordre-là?
What is the value of such a unique piece? It's difficult to quantify it. How much are you willing to pay to be the owner of that watch?
On parle plutôt ici de l'utilisation de matériaux rares et précieux.
And in the other case, it's about the use of gold, platinum, palladium, or other precious materials. So it's a case where the value increases because the materials used have their own intrinsic value.
J'aime bien ce graphique parce qu'en fait, il montre beaucoup de choses.
I like this
à gauche,
chart
vous voyez
because it shows a lot of things.
les marques qui ont
On the
un
left,
héritage, qui
you
ont
have the
une
brands
notoriété
that have a
qui leur
heritage
permet aujourd'hui, et on verra ça
that
dans
are
le prochain
renowned
slide,
enough
d'offrir à leurs clients un
to
chèque allant
provide
jusqu'à
their
20 000
clients
francs quand ils
for
achètent une montre dans leur boutique.
to provide their clients
Si je dis
with
ça, c'est parce qu'aujourd'hui, vous allez acheter une
20,000 or
Daytona chez
30,000
Rolex,
check when
vous
they
allez la
go
payer à peu près
to
13 000
their
francs.
shop.
Et vous
Today,
pouvez la
if you go to
revendre en sortant
Rolex,
de la boutique,
you can buy
à peu
it
près à 35 000 francs, je pense.
for 13,000, but
Donc
you
c'est
can
vraiment quelque
resell
chose
it.
qui est assez exceptionnel et qui est intrinsèque à
That's
cette
something
industrie.
quite exceptional
C'est qu'il y a des
that
marques
you
qui ont
see
aujourd'hui
in
une
this
tellement
industry.
forte demande et une tellement forte
Some
notoriété
brands
qu'elles offrent à
are
leurs clients une
in such
augmentation
demand
immédiate de la valeur
that the
de la
client who
pièce,
buys a product
vraiment littéralement
obtains a
sortant de la
product
Et puis,
the value of which has immediately increased the moment it comes out of the shop. Rolex is the number one brand, the Swiss brand, and then you have these independent brands, Audemars, Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Richard Mille.
Une valeur de marque qui leur permet de vendre presque
They have that brand value,
mais pas à n'importe quel prix.
Which means that they can sell almost anything,
Ensuite, on a
but not at any
la
price.
partie innovation et technologie. Alors, j'ai volontairement pris quelque chose
Then there's the innovation and technology factor.
Pour illustrer
I deliberately used a digital example to illustrate innovation.
Montre de poche de Vacheron avec un
And again, you have a Vacheron pocket watch
complications.
with a huge amount of complications.
On va parler maintenant de la valeur du marché des montres de luxe. Alors en fait, il n'y a pas un marché
the
des montres de
market
luxe,
value
mais
of luxury watches.
Il y a le marché du neuf.
There's
et il y a le
different
marché de
markets.
Donc,
The market of
tout à l'heure avec
brand new
l'exemple de
watches
Rolex et de la
and
Daytona,
second-hand
qui vaut
watches.
35 000 francs en sortie de boutique.
I gave that example with
la
a
différence
watch that
entre ces deux
is
marchés.
worth 35,000 if you have just bought it, and then there's the second-hand value.
Il est déterminé
So there's the
par
primary
des
and
facteurs
secondary market.
qui sont,
And the value of those
rationnels
prices is determined by factors
objectifs et connus. Et fixes.
factors that are
Donc, on parlait des coûts de
objective
fabrication, des
and
matériaux utilisés, la
known,
stratégie de la marque.
fix.
Et puis on a le marché secondaire où là, on est vraiment
That's for the primary
influencé,
market.
par
And
la
then on the
rareté,
secondary market, you're
par,
influenced by
évidemment, le cas de la
scarcity,
montre, le niveau de la demande des
by the
collectionneurs
state of the
et
watch,
les
the
tendances
demand by
du
collectors, and the trends in the market.
Alors les graphiques là sont assez
These graphs
intéressants et assez
are
incroyables. Donc, je vais
interesting
vous donner les dates parce que je pense
and
pas que vous
astonishing.
voyez à partir de là.
I'm going
Mais
to
on
give you the
compare
dates. I
entre
don't think
décembre
you're able to
2021
see.
et novembre
We're
2022.
comparing
Donc,
between
on est,
December
c'est,
2021
la
and
courbe
November
des prix,
2022.
en une année.
So that's
Le premier, c'est
the
pour l'ensemble
trend
du
of
marché.
prices over a
Et puis,
year.
le second,
The first is for the overall
pour,
market. The
les trois
second,
marques phares de l'industrie qui sont Rolex, Patek et
third,
Audemars
and
Piguet.
fourth are for the
Donc, on
three
voit, assez
leading
clairement,
brands,
sans
Rolex,
aller,
Patek, and Audemars.
profondément dans les chiffres, que la valeur en une année, elle a
You see that the value
est redescendue de
doubled
moitié.
and then
Et en fait,
halved
quelle est
in
la
a year.
raison de cette tendance globale qu'on a
How
pu
come?
observer entre 2021 et 2022? Eh bien, elle est directement liée à la pandémie de Covid.
Well,
au
that's
fait que
directly
les
linked
marques
to the
ont
COVID pandemic.
énormément réduit
Brands
leur offre, étant donné qu'il y a eu des fermetures pendant la pandémie.
narrowed down their offer
Qu'en parallèle,
because of
le
the closures from the pandemic.
clients qui étaient chez eux à la maison,
But in
qui
parallel,
ne pas dans d'autres
clients which were stuck at home and weren't spending on tourism and other activities
et en fait, c'est la conjoncture de ces deux
increased the demand. And it's
éléments
because of those two elements, because of their combination, that the price
Ce qu'il faut savoir,
will
c'est
actually,
qu'ici, on parle
tender
uniquement du
increase
delta, on parle
spectacularly.
pas du prix du neuf au prix de l'occasion. Et on voit qu'en une année, on est vraiment passé du simple au double. Donc,
And
il
you
y a
see
beaucoup
that you
d'opportunistes
doubled
cette tendance en
the value
spéculation,
over
pour revendre.
half a year.
Et c'est quelque chose qui, pour nous, en tant que marque, on essaie d'éviter au maximum.
As a brand,
Et à
we're
beaucoup
trying
plus
to
large échelle, des
avoid
marques
that
comme
as much
Rolex,
as possible.
Audemars Piguet ou Patek Philippe vont vous
And
mettre
those
sur des listes
brands
d'attente, vont essayer de vous connaître,
try to put you on
pour
a waiting
s'assurer
list
que le
and
jour
to
où
get
vous
to
passez
know
commande
you,
chez
to
eux,
make sure that
la
the
montre
day
ira
you
à
do
votre
buy
poignet,
something,
pas pour être vendue,
you're
et
buying
pour
it
éviter
to
que les
wear it
spéculateurs
and not to
fassent,
sell it.
faussent le marché.
The idea is to avoid
en achetant
allowing
les pièces pour les
speculators to create distortions on the market by buying pieces just to resell them.
On est quand même
Now,
dans
about
une
future
période
perspectives.
où le marché commence à être relativement bouleversé. On a beaucoup de tendances qui émergent, notamment avec l'arrivée
There's
des
a
nouvelles
lot of
générations comme les
disruptions
millennials et la
and new
génération
markets.
Z.
We
On a
have
beaucoup
millennials
de
and the
challenges,
Z
en termes
generations.
d'authenticité, en termes
Lots of challenges
d'éthique, en
in terms of
de
authenticity, ethics,
CSR.
and CSR.
Et on a des technologies émergentes qui peuvent nous aider
And new
justement
technologies can help
à
us.
faciliter la réponse à adresser ces différents challenges.
They can help us
On a
overcome
aussi
these
évidemment
challenges.
l'impact économique.
We also have
Donc, on est
the
sur un
economic
produit de luxe. Le
impact.
marché du luxe est
This is a luxury product, and the luxury market
dépendant
is
des différentes crises
relatively
économiques.
reliant
L'horlogerie,
on
on a
economic
des cycles où c'est
crises.
des cycles de
Watchmaking
vaches
is
maigres, et
a
puis on a
cyclical
d'autres,
market.
cycles
You
où
have
tout le monde
moments
achète
where there's
n'importe quoi.
very little demand, and then
Et puis,
other moments
je le
where
disais,
everyone's
le rôle de la
buying
durabilité et de l'éthique, c'est
left and right.
vraiment aujourd'hui un des enjeux
And sustainability and ethics are among key challenges today. We need to certify the origin of materials to prove that no child labor was involved.
de base qu'on utilise.
And this goes all the way to basic materials we use, like brass, steel, and the luxury market requires this. Requests sustainability as well.
La définition de la valeur, elle peut être soit objective, soit subjective.
So value can be defined objectively or subjectively. During the roundtable, we'll be seeing that this bears importance when you're comparing with Bitcoin.
On voit que le Bitcoin, c'est quelque
With the history of watchmaking, we can compare with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is relatively new, while watchmaking has been in existence for centuries. And watches from centuries ago are different from new watches. So it could be interesting to look at that, to compare.
Deux modèles différents, c'est des clients qui sont aussi différents.
Also, with industry versus craftsmanship, you have different values.
Le fait d'être une marque pour les professionnels ou d'être une marque plutôt liée à la mode, on peut avoir vraiment.
And whether you're a brand tailoring to professionals or tailoring to fashionistas, you're not doing things the same way.
Malheureusement.
And finally, there's the market value and speculation. Unfortunately, that is eroding the industry.
Quel autre bien matériel vous pouvez trouver?
My question is, what other material good could you go out and buy where, as soon as you bought it, the good doubles in value? I don't think you'll find anything, but if you do, I'd like to hear what that is.
Oui, merci. J'ai déjà évoqué l'idée à Marco d'une collaboration avec Shiro Masamune pour une montre à esprit cyberpunk.
Collaborate with Shiro Masamune for a steampunk watch, and I think Bitcoiners would like that. And now you'll hear Ludovic Lars. He wrote the...
Toutes les personnes qui ont envie de creuser un peu le trou du lapin, comme on dit, c'est la lecture parfaite.
Really recommend that reading. It's a great introduction, and then it really digs deep.
Nous donner sa version de l'origine.
So he'll tell us about his version of the origin of value of Bitcoin.
1, 2, 1, 2.
1, 2, 1, 2. It's working.
Ok. Donc bonjour à tous et merci à Marco pour cette présentation. Merci.
Hello everyone. Thanks Marco for the presentation. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation.
Du Bitcoin.
I'm glad you called on me to explain where Bitcoin derives its value from. My name is Ludovic Lars.
J'ai un profil un peu technique de base, mais
my background is technical, but I've diversified since I got interested in Bitcoin. I write a lot, and I wrote a book entitled The Elegance of Bitcoin. So it's something to help you learn more about Bitcoin, and it's on offer. You can buy it upstairs. And I also have this website, viresinnumeris.fr. I wanted to look at the history and the logic of Bitcoin. So I will speak about the value proposition of Bitcoin at the end. Briefly, what is Bitcoin? It's a digital cash system. Bitcoin is two things. When I write it with a capital B, it's the protocol, so the set of rules applied by a network, and then there's the normal letter Bitcoin, which is a unit of account governed by said protocol. There's the emission, the monetary system, and the transfer payment system.
Donc pourquoi on connaît le Bitcoin souvent?
That's Bitcoin 101 for those who didn't know.
C'est ça dont parlent beaucoup les médias et on peut voir sur ce
When the media talk about Bitcoin, it's a lot to discuss its price. So that's what you see in logarithmic scale. Each line is a multiplication by 10. And here you can see that the price started very low, 5 cents of a dollar, and it reached colossal levels over the years. It's very volatile. In 2011, you went to $30, and at the end of the year, it was $2. And today, I think we have a record of above 60,000. I will mainly be speaking about the history of Bitcoin, which I know a little bit. I'm just going to give main pointers. I'm not going to go into detail. Those pointers are useful to have the proper context. Bitcoin was presented by Satoshi Nakamoto. He was an individual or a group of individuals, but I like to think it was an individual.
Et donc il a publié un livre blanc sur un recoin obscur d'Internet.
He published a white paper in a dark corner of the Internet the 31st of October 2008. A few months later, the 8th of January, he published the code and launched the network, which is still going today. And that's when we saw the first miners, and Satoshi was one of them.
Quelques mois, enfin 10 mois après.
On the 12th of October, so 10 months later, it was the first exchange of Bitcoin for dollars, and back then it was 0.1 cent. On the 9th of February, the price reached parity. So parity of US dollar versus Bitcoin, so it was 1 BTC for $1, so it showed that the project took off, and that's when Satoshi Nakamoto decided to completely disappear from the networks, and he sent his final emails to Bitcoin contributors at the time. So in this presentation, I will tell you about the value of Bitcoin as a currency. That's the central value proposition. There is also time stamping that we talked about earlier, but the biggest part of the value is the monetary value in the broad sense. Then I will tell you about how Bitcoin acquired a price, and then I will tell you about the value proposition that exists today. So what is money? I define it as a medium of exchange. What's the use of a medium of exchange? It helps to solve the issue of the double coincidence of wants. If I have meat and if you have bread, and if we want to exchange, our needs will not coincide depending on the place we are, on the time and the amount that we want to exchange. So money is a medium. So I will sell my meat and use this money to buy meat, and this meat can be dollar or Swiss francs or gold, silver, or of course Bitcoin.
Et donc de cette fonctionnalité
thanks to this main feature, we can have other functions such as the reserve of value, so we can move value over time, and with the unit of account you can calculate the value.
Alors, qu'est-ce qui fait la valeur de la monnaie?
What makes the value of money?
La monnaie a une valeur sur le marché.
Money has a value on the market, which is the objective exchange value, what we also call purchasing power.
Donc, les acteurs du marché font que
market actors
cette valeur converge vers un chiffre
make this value converge towards a unique value. It's not always the case, but on a well-functioning market, that's what you achieve. Someone called Marty Malmi, who's one of the first contributors of the Bitcoin project, was a student, a Finnish student who worked or focused on anarcho-capitalism, and he contacted Satoshi in April 2009, and Satoshi asked him to write an FAQ, frequent asked questions, in which he said that the value of Bitcoin is determined by the things it can be exchanged for, just like all traditional paper currencies. So what makes the value of money is the ability for it to be exchanged with for something else. So it's linked to its main use, which is to be a medium of exchange. So that can be measured according to the goods and services that you can acquire thanks to this money.
En revanche, il y a un problème qui se pose dans le cadre des monnaies numériques, c'est le problème qu'on appelle problème de l'amorçage,
which is the issue of initiation, which was mentioned by Hal Finney in 2009, and he said that one immediate problem with any new currency is how to value it. So if the money doesn't have any value on the market, you will not acquire this value, you won't be able to exchange it for something else, so you will have to find a basic value which is not a monetary value. This has to be linked to an economics theorem, which is the regression theorem of Ludovic von Mises. Ludovic von Mises was an economist from the Austrian School of Economics. He was based in Vienna in the 19th century, but this school then spread to the whole world.
Et donc cet économiste
so this economist
écrit en 1912
wrote in 1912
qui était justement l'énoncé du théorème de
was kind of the regression theorem. So the theory of the value of money as such can only bring the objective exchange value up to a point where it ceases to be the value of money and becomes the value of a commodity. So in other terms, in order to use money, you need to use the value it had the day before, and this way, through regression, you can link the value of money to a value that is not monetary initially. So for gold or silver, its initial use, its initial value was ornamental and religious for temples, etc. As to paper money, this can be linked to the regression of gold because paper money was backed by gold up until 1914, strictly until 1914 in Europe and 1933 in the US. But for cryptocurrencies and for bitcoins, we do not have this type of regression. We can't go back millennia, so we have to ask ourselves where the value of Bitcoin comes from. And so Austrian economists are looking for the non-monetary value, and since Mises used terms such as the industrial value, we tend to think that it has to be an objective value, such as the value of gold, which is ornamental, but this can be a subjective value, and that's how Bitcoin acquired its value. So now I will tell you about how Bitcoin acquired its price. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't when the Bitcoin was exchanged for $1 that it acquired value. The first miners used to spend electrical energy in order to acquire Bitcoin in exchange. So this was an economic exchange. So from the start, we could ask why they were doing that and why they were acquiring Bitcoins. So the difficulty cannot go down to a certain level, so you need to have a minimum level of effort in order to obtain Bitcoin. In 2009, it was about a minimum difficulty was about 4.3 billion calculations in order to try and find a block. And in exchange, a miner could have 50 Bitcoin per block plus transaction fees when they were added later. As part of those miners, there were Hal Finney, who was a former cypherpunk, and he had already been experiencing playing with digital currencies, and he tried to launch his own system, AirPow, in 2004, but this didn't really take off. And the other miner was Dustin Trammell, who started mining on the 13th of January. He was an American engineer who was also interested in digital currencies, but more centralized ones, such as the Liberty Dollar. You can see a picture of him here. And he was the third miner on the network, knowing that Satoshi was the first one and Hal Finney was the second one. Why did they start mining? Very often, three reasons are mentioned to explain this willingness to mine. First of all, there is the technical curiosity of engineers and IT specialists. But this is not a sustainable explanation, because once you have mined a few blocks, this is fun, this has been fun, but then you stop. So there needed to be some motivation, and that's what led the two previous persons I mentioned to mine. They mined for months. Hal Finney mined until late March 2009 and Dustin Trammell until early 2010. So he mined many bitcoins, tens of thousands of bitcoins.
Et donc ces raisons, il y en a deux principales.
There are two main reasons. Ideological motivation, so people who are doing this in order to support an ideal in the real world, and then there is the speculative interest, which is the most well-known, the hope that you will achieve some financial gain. Ideological motivations are mostly linked to
liées à la liberté comme
freedom, so libertarianism, US libertarianism,
en France, tout ce qui est librisme, etc.
or anything related to freedom in France. So for many,
le projet d'une monnaie numérique robuste.
Bitcoin was
c'est Halfine notamment qui
the idea of a robust digital money, and Halfine used to say, he said in 2008,
une bonne cause.
Comparing Bitcoin to a good cause,
de calcul distribué comme SETI at home ou
he compared it to City at home or Folding at home, so projects
qui se proposent de distribuer
that offer to
pour faire beaucoup
share the calculation,
computation. Et donc le
carry out
SETI, c'était
a lot of computing. So Folding at home, for instance, was a project to simulate the activity of protein, so this could be used in the medical field.
Dans le cadre du Covid, il me semble.
It was also used in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So Halfine said that the Bitcoin system turns out to be socially useful and valuable, so that node operators feel that they are making a beneficial contribution to the world by their efforts, similar to the various at-home computer projects where people volunteer their computing resources for good causes. And his point of view was approved by Satoshi Nakamoto, who responded to this email. That's a public email that was published on a mailing list. And Satoshi said that it was very attractive from a libertarian point of view if it can be explained properly. So he knew to which audience he was talking to.
Ensuite, second exemple, l'exemple de Russell Brick, donc c'est le fondateur de la plateforme
Russell Brick, who created the Silk Road platform, which was a marketplace on the dark web, and I will tell you a bit more about it later. And he was incarcerated in 2013. He's still in prison because on this marketplace, illegal goods and mostly drugs were being sold. So in 2019, Russell Ulbricht wrote that it is magic that Bitcoin came out from nothing without previous value and without authoritarian decree became money, but it didn't come from a vacuum. It was the response to a problem on which cryptographers were working, how to create a money that cannot be counterfeited and that can be worthy of trust. So you can see the ideological motivation, and that's also what led Halfine to mine the way he did, as well as other individuals. Second reason is speculation. As you know, Bitcoin is characterized by absolute and unforgeable rarity. So in theory, there will never be more than 21 million Bitcoins. So that led to some enthusiasm, encouraged people to adopt this up-and-coming currency, incling Halfine. And this is something that he mentioned in January 2009 in a mail sent to a mailing list. He predicted the unit price of Bitcoin amounting to $10 million. It was a bit of a wrong estimate because it was based on the global wealth of the world, but the idea was very good. And he used to say the ability or the possibility of generating units today with just a few cents of computing time could therefore be a very good bet. So the risk was quite small, but the reward, the potential reward, was huge.
Il a donc fait un très bon pari.
So his bet was very good. On the right-hand side, you can see the first graph showing
le nombre de Bitcoin en circulation
the amount of circulating Bitcoin compared to the currency creation rate, and we can see that the Bitcoin is becoming more and more rare. Less and less Bitcoins are being created, and that's why people speculate over Bitcoin.
Ensuite, pour aller un peu plus loin dans l'histoire de Bitcoin, il faut
go a bit further in the history of Bitcoin, we have to talk about
du fait que le
the fact
Bitcoin a un vrai prix sur le marché, sur un marché de change. Et donc,
really acquired a price on the exchange market, and it's worth mentioning New Liberty Standard, NLS. That was an individual who was passionate about precious metals, as you can see with their avatar, and they used to see Bitcoin as digital gold, and he launched the first currency exchange service between BTC and US dollars. So he was the one providing cash, and he offered to sell or buy Bitcoin from people.
Pour estimer les taux de change,
to estimate exchange rates, he would estimate the energy costs needed for him to obtain Bitcoin. So he would take the price of electricity where he was and his production frequency, and he calculated a variable exchange rate, as you can see on the right-hand side. Those exchange rates went from for $1
Bitcoin le 5 octobre par exemple selon son estimation.
It was 1,300 Bitcoins, for instance.
Et donc le 12 octobre 2009.
So on the 12th of October 2009, his first client was Martti Malmi, the Finnish student who was helping Satoshi at the time. So Malmi went to see him. They carried out the first exchange. Martti Malmi gave him 5,050 bitcoins that NLS bought for $5 on PayPal. So that's a unit price of $0.001. So as you can see, the price increased since then.
Le premier essor commercial.
This was followed by the first commercial boom. It really started to take off in late 2009, and in January 2010, on the Bitcoin forum, you could see the first users going for adoption of Bitcoin, and NLS would promote the commercial construction and would write, anyone who buys or sells goods using Bitcoin, including those who exchange money, is helping the Bitcoin economy to grow. Let everyone do their part, buy or sell something in exchange for Bitcoin. So following this, you could see the emergence of several exchange services, such as Bitcoin Market or OneGox, but it was in July. We also saw the first poker game with Bitcoin. The winner won about 500 Bitcoins, as well as web hosting, VPN services, and you've had VPN that started in 2010, if you know it. But the most emblematic example is that of the pizza episode. It's a person called Laszlo Anyek, who's an American engineer of Hungarian descent, who lived in Florida, and on the forum on the 18th of May 2010 posted saying that he wanted a pizza in exchange for 10,000 bitcoins. That represented about $41 on the exchange market. On the 22nd of May, the exchange took place with Jeremy Sturdivan on the right-hand side. So he received 2 pizzas from Papa John's that were ordered by Jeremy Sturdivan. So this first sale was the first purchase of a physical item with Bitcoins.
Et on appelle ça le Bitcoin Pizza Day.
So we call it the Bitcoin Pizza Day. And finally, how to avoid speaking about Silk Road. This was a marketplace on the dark web that used Tor and Bitcoin. It was created by Ross Ulbricht. He was a young Texan guy, libertarian, who supported Ron Paul back then. Through this platform, he wanted to destabilize the state. On the 27th of January 2011, he launched the marketplace, and very quickly we saw that people were exchanging drugs on the marketplace, mostly cannabis, but also gold,
et des drogues un peu plus dures.
And
et donc cette plateforme a eu un succès assez
stronger substances. So this marketplace
2011, on va dire.
Was very successful starting from spring 2011, and between 2012 and 2013 it represented 10 to 20% of the activity on the blockchain. So Bitcoin was perfect in this context because it helped
ce qui faisait que on pouvait pas être censuré pour des
having some resistance to censorship, so you can't be censored for exchanges, so you could buy drugs and receive it by mail, and many people discovered Bitcoin in this way. So that is part of the history of the value of Bitcoin. So from that point, Bitcoin really took off
jusqu'à donc aujourd'hui.
Up until today. And so now I will focus more on the value proposition. What is it for? And we will also discuss it during the roundtable. Why does Bitcoin have value? Usually I link it to two things, but I included 4 elements here because they are all related somehow.
En fait, il y a 4 fonctionnalités
so
qui sont intéressantes dans Bitcoin. Donc,
features of Bitcoin that are interesting. First of all, resistance to censorship. It's difficult to prevent a transaction from happening. This is not the case for the banking system, where the bank can ask you for additional information and can block the transaction, freeze your account, etc. It's also resilient to inflation, meaning that it's difficult to create more units than there are units. There is a defined monetary policy that is very difficult to change. Third feature, confidentiality. You can reveal information about the transactions carried out, but the identities of the parties of the transaction are not known. And finally, programmability, meaning that you can carry out various financial operations in the blockchain. Same thing as smart contracts, fiduciary deposits, etc. So those 4 features are quite important to estimate the value of Bitcoin.
Je vais finir par vous présenter en vous présentant les cas d'utilisation.
To conclude, I will present the use cases for Bitcoin. First of all,
des cas qui sont toujours d'actualité, évidemment. Le premier, c'est le commerce en ligne.
Cases that are still quite topical. So first of all, online commerce,
ce qui peut avantager
there is no chargeback with Bitcoin. That could encourage merchants that do not want this kind of complication. There is also timestamping. We already talked about this, so I will not dwell on this. You also have autonomous contracts, so it's possible to program
des clauses dans les UTXOs.
Some clauses in UTXOs.
Mettre en place des contrats, dont notamment le dépôt fiduciaire, où là, en fait, vous allez bloquer l'argent.
Have contracts such as fiduciary deposits. If you want to exchange with another person on eBay, you will block the money within a contract, and as long as you have not received the good, you will not release the funds. And if there is any dispute, you will be able to refer to a third party, but only in case of a dispute. So this contract helps improving economic exchanges. Then you have everything related to micropayments, especially with the Lightning Network, meaning that you can stream sats on Lightning for payments, for payroll systems on the internet. In the real world, you have international transfers. The image you can see is an ad from 2014 where Bitcoin fees were compared to those of Western Union. So Bitcoin helps reducing fees for those who want to send money abroad and to avoid all the complications linked to regulation, legal provisions, etc. This is quite practical. I don't know if you had to transfer money outside of the EU, but very often it's very difficult, especially if you want to send money to China. Then you have everything related to political activism, so to fund projects that are under scrutiny by the government, especially WikiLeaks. It's an NGO that revealed confidential documents, helping whistleblowers to reveal confidential documents on wars, etc. And in 2010, WikiLeaks published documents on the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which led the US government to tighten its scrutiny, and that led to banking of Visa, MasterCard operations for WikiLeaks. And so WikiLeaks lost 95% of its revenue because of that. And a few months later, in June 2001, WikiLeaks started accepting donations in Bitcoin, which was quite relevant. You also have Sci-Hub, which is a platform where you can publish scientific documents without any copyright. So this is illegal, and this is also funded with Bitcoin, with hundreds of thousands of dollars. Then you have everything, every marginal activity, so the sale of cannabis in the US, which is legal, but often not accepted by banks because there is a risk associated. So Bitcoin helps avoiding all the legal difficulties that can be related to those operations. And finally, Bitcoin can be a means of saving. It can help you keep sovereign value outside of banks and outside of the control of states.
Oui, petite conclusion du coup.
A short conclusion.
Donc ça c'est mon livre. Si jamais vous voulez.
This is my book. If you'd like to purchase it, I mentioned the history of Bitcoin, the origin of Bitcoin, all the principles, the security model of Bitcoin. It is also available online on the Consensus Network shop and on Amazon, as well as on the floor above. Thank you very much for your attention.
Donc là, vous m'entendez?
Can you hear me well? All right, let's start our final roundtable of the day. This is an opportunity to bring in Alex from How to Bitcoin, which is a media that solely focuses on Bitcoin. It's a francophone. We also have Hugues Jeannerat with us, who is an expert in watchmaking value.
Tu voulais te présenter ou...
Did you want to introduce yourself, maybe?
Alors, bonjour à tous.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As was said by Nicolas, we will talk about value during this panel. We'll try to take a step back. We won't talk about the price because it's quite hard to value Bitcoin. But I have a first question for you, and it's a question that's quite important to me. According to you, and I'm referring to Bitcoin as much as watchers, do you think the value of Bitcoin comes from the amount of work invested in it, be it mining or energy consumption, as it is the case for research for watch, so the work of the watchmaker? Who would like to start? Anyone who wants to start can take the floor.
Alors la question est super intéressante.
That's a really interesting question. I spoke of objective versus subjective value in my presentation.
Donc la réponse est non.
So the answer is both yes and no. The objective value, the cost price,
qui représente la valeur du travail,
represents the value of the work, while the subjective value and speculation,
que la demande va devenir bien supérieure à l'offre,
believing that the demand will exceed the supply and will therefore increase the price, that has nothing to do with the value of work.
Moi, je m'opposerais un peu à ce point de vue parce que
I'm a little bit. I disagree with this a little bit.
À la base subjective, même si on peut.
Because my point of view.
C'est-à-dire que c'est pas lié au travail.
Is to believe that it is inherently subjective.
Que l'autre va apporter.
I think the value is determined by the person who's going to buy.
Ce qu'on a fourni va apporter à ce qu'on a fait justement. Et donc, par exemple, si vous creusez
for example,
au milieu du désert,
if you burr a hole in the middle of the desert and you fill it back, no one's going to pay you just because you spent energy. In Bitcoin, we believe that the value comes from the cost of mining, but that's not really true. That's not true at all. It's not that simple, but it's more that the cost of mining follows the reward, the creation of money. So it's more that the cost of mining follows the price of Bitcoin rather than the opposite.
On peut évidemment raisonner sur justement
But we can reflect
mais la valeur est essentiellement subjective pour moi.
On work. However, for me, the value is essentially subjective.
La question, elle est assez historique, en fait.
I think the question is historical. If you take all economics theories and labor theory, you go back to the Industrial Revolution, to Ricardo Marx, where the value is created by work and by the value of material, as well as time. It takes time to extract resources. The two cases we're looking at today, luxury, watchmaking, and Bitcoin, reflect today's society that's very intangible. The value of the work behind it all is relative. So it exists, but often it's work that's not valued as it should be. For example, with digital, many digital businesses extract the value, but they're relying on an army of workers to extract data. So today we're in this intangible economy, and that raises questions about the value of work. Right, so if I recap, part of the work will be valued by the buyer, so someone who buys Bitcoin or a watch will factor in the work that went into Bitcoin or the watch. That will be factored into their appreciation and the price? Yes, but today the work is oriented towards the valuation in services, for example with marketing, but also all of the activities surrounding something like the digital currency of Bitcoin. The public today and everyone we're examining are participating in valuing this intangible asset. The work resides in creation of value more than in creation of goods and services. Right. So the next question is for Marco. We're talking about the value of work and what went into it, but I don't really know what went into making a watch. How much did it cost? What's the structure of cost? Well, the bulk of the cost in high-level watchmaking is in the manual work and the artisanry.
Donc, imaginons qu'on est déjà une entreprise.
In the production cycle of a piece, take a company that uses digital orders.
De fixation de la montre,
if they take platine or a bridge or things that help fixate a watch, it takes 2 to 3 days working 8 hours a day to manually get to a finish and an ornament level that's considered high range. That's the level that we want to offer our clients. Earlier I was saying the calculation is easy. Take the number of components multiplied by the amount of time spent. There are fixed costs, and they're considerable, but most of the value is created by man. And the difference between high-range luxury watchmaking and industrial watchmaking is the intervention of the artisan, of the human component. A Rolex is made industrially. There are fewer and fewer operations done by hand. It's a whole machinery and it's done impeccably, but it's not comparable to something handmade like Richard Piguet, Patek Philippe.
Ce segment qui a le vent en poupe va encore plus loin dans ce niveau de finition. Et finalement, sans la main de l'homme,
and we're going even farther now in terms of finish, and without having that handmade component, we don't have as much value. We heard different aspects of Bitcoin and watches being cited, and there's one aspect of value we didn't mention. It's the one on black market. Watches are easily movable. It's difficult to realize that a watch was given. Do you think that the use of Bitcoin on the black market is part of its value, or do you think that's in the past? Well, I didn't want to talk about the black market here.
Le Bitcoin est toujours utilisé sur le marché noir.
But yes, Bitcoin is still in use on the dark web with Monero.
Une faible part de l'activité de Bitcoin, c'est moins de 1%.
It's a low share of Bitcoin activity. It's less than 1% today, so it's become marginal.
Après, il y a tout ce qui est entre le marché complètement réglementé et le marché noir.
Between the white market and the black market, there is a spectrum. Yes, for example, a transaction in Iran in Bitcoin, that's illegal, right? Yes, well, it all depends on how you define the black market. But that's where Bitcoin comes from. In the case of watchmaking, it's a lower share. It's maybe a millionth of a percent. But in the luxury space,
passer de l'argent, sortir de l'argent dans les pays. Je pense notamment aux
there are means used to extract some materials from countries. For example, precious gems.
Une cote et une valeur marchande.
Like Bitcoin, there's a price, a market value.
Il y a des moyens, je pense, bien plus faciles aujourd'hui.
I think there are much easier ways today to move that kind of good than to use a watch. Maybe the term black market is too specific. I would talk about the informal economy. Some examples of informal economy are more about capital leak or lack of control. But in watchmaking, there was a recent Chinese law aimed at reducing corruption. And corruption took the form of watches being offered, for example, as bribes. All informal circulation circuits could be looked at here. And we'd be coming back to goods that used to be traded in international commerce. But I think I prefer the term informal economy. Right. I wanted to talk about scarcity. I think it's one of the first things that comes up when we talk about Bitcoin. What's the cost of scarcity in the valuation, or in the valuation of a watch or of Bitcoin? How does it translate? Scarcity is one of the most important aspects of Bitcoin. Today, you could say it's the rarest fungible good there ever was. Well, if Bitcoin holds its promises. It's rarer than gold. And that's what creates the speculation. That's what draws people to it, to speculate about it. But the value is also derived from the rest, everything I mentioned. Those aspects that make people flock to Bitcoin to be immune from financial fluctuations.
Oui, alors sur la rareté horlogère, évidemment, ça fait partie des...
About scarcity in watchmaking, well, that's one of the criteria of desirability of watches. Just like Bitcoin,
de maintenir une offre inférieure à la demande.
Brands should try to keep supply below demand, to make sure that scarcity remains high and the price too. I don't think there's only one scale for all of the industry. For different brands, even in the same segment, you have different levels of scarcity. So I agree with what was said about everything that helps create the value, marketing, customer service, the image of the brand. All of this helps engineer scarcity. Watches are a luxury product. By definition, it's not a necessary product, since it's luxury, and so we do seek scarcity. I would not limit the discussion to scarcity, because that's not where all of the value relies. If you don't desire it, you don't care that it's rare. There's many things that are rare and that you're not willing to pay for. So what really matters was what we had at the end of the presentation on Bitcoin, the value proposition.
Elle est un petit peu éludée. Je dirais, au départ, il y avait des gens qui avaient une proposition de valeur claire. C'était une décentralisation.
And at the beginning, there was a clear value proposition, the decentralization, the freedom. There was this reactionary aspect. But I feel like this was needed at the beginning to initiate the movement. But now we have those features that you mentioned at the end, and those features are
Et puis moi, je pense que par contre, dans l'horlogerie, elle est vraiment obligée
are proving their advantage.
50 ans. Donc cette proposition de valeur.
And in watchmaking, the value proposition has been continually worked on. It's always challenged. So the value proposition is even more important than scarcity. In my eyes, the value proposition doesn't need to change to be worked on. I think it's been the same since the beginning. The protocol hasn't changed much, but what changes is what people make of it. And the narrative is created in the minds of people, but we can do the same we've always been able to do. We can share value peer-to-peer. So I think mindsets have changed, but the value proposition has not left us. Bitcoin is always this choice that hopefully will always be a choice to operate a transaction peer-to-peer in an inalterable way. So I think the social interest behind Bitcoin has not changed because that value proposition has not changed. It's not needed to change because since the first day it's been an absolute revolution. Well, I'll be devil's advocate, but it's the same with watches. The tourbillon, the basic mechanism has not changed in years, but the value proposition that we add to that technology that didn't change, that value proposition has changed. And you align technology with the value proposition. If today you're creating these complications based on the tourbillon and you're showcasing that, it's because there's value proposition for a client and a community, and it's really important. Today, we're employing those hands to do all that work you mentioned, and that's because you have a value proposition. Otherwise, the work makes no sense. So what I'm saying is with Bitcoin, there was that value proposition, but is it really the same nowadays? Well, the watch is used to tell time. The value proposition has been there, it's been solved for a while. But with Bitcoin, you don't need marketing, you don't need to sell newcomers to the market the product. It doesn't need a living narrative. It's not a living market like you have for watches. You don't need to add complications, you don't need to add other things. You can add layers, but it won't really add anything. And it's two objects that aren't really similar. That's why what's true for the watch is not necessarily true for Bitcoin for me.
Au fil de la discussion, c'est ce qui va ressortir, c'est qu'il y a vraiment une différence.
I agree. I think what we'll see is that there's ultimately a difference between a transaction vector and a product. But the value proposition of watchmaking today goes beyond the product. The product, in some cases, is even secondary.
Ce qu'on voit aujourd'hui dans le milieu de collectionneurs, des gens qui connaissent
in the world of collectors, the world of connoisseurs and independent makers, what they care about is not the wearing of a watch. They care about connecting, about
qui décore, qui assemble ces produits-là, c'est pouvoir les rencontrer sur des événements,
the meeting
spécialisés comme Watchmaker United, c'est pour
between people of meeting the people who make them.
Pouvoir donner un input sur le produit ou sur ce qui doit
It's about clients coming to the manufacture place.
Il vient le fait que
about giving meaning.
Puis qu'effectivement elles donnent leur.
Tu fais une transition parfaite avec ce...
Well, that's a perfect segue into what I wanted to talk about. The role of storytelling and the historical aspect that plays a role in valuation. Bitcoin also has its history and of watches, but maybe we'll start with Bitcoin.
Bitcoin n'a que 15 ans, mais il a déjà une histoire.
Well, Bitcoin is only 15 years old, but it does have a history already.
Parce que elle va changer
and it's an important history.
Bitcoin.
It's going to change the way in which we present it. The fact that Bitcoin was created by an anonymous individual that called themselves Satoshi Nakamoto and said very little about themselves and their personal data, and the fact that they disappeared to leave the project in the hands of the community, that's what intrigued people. And that's what made it a community topic. The Satoshi mystery is the great story that's told to beginners. It's what fascinates people. And that plays a role in the marketing. You said there was no marketing for Bitcoin, but I disagree. There's definitely a marketing campaign. Absolutely. All of the presentation showed that Bitcoin didn't come out of the blue. There was a marketing build-up. And we find the same type of communities today. We have the same people speculating on Bitcoin as people who congregate about Rolex and other products. There's a whole community of connoisseurs, people who know about high-end watchmaking and who share values. And the value proposition behind Bitcoin is a bit different there. Yes, there's a big parallel between the core of the Bitcoin community and the core of the watchmaking community. When it was created by Satoshi, there were about a handful of people, and you can name them, and then there was a transaction, and it grew from there. My father, who's 85 years old today, knows what Bitcoin is, even though he'll never do a Bitcoin transaction. It's something that's become democratized. And making transactions, whether for legal products or not, through Bitcoin doesn't make you part of that core group. And it's the same for watchmaking. At the beginning, you have a core group of people who are interested, who go into the minute technical details. Then you have the early adopters, so that's kind of the second wave. And then it becomes so well known. It's mainstream.
La rareté, par effet de levier,
in the end,
valeur va aussi énormément
mechanically,
et de la force de
the value depends on the community and the strength of that community beyond marketing. Okay.
Par exemple, sur votre marque, qui avait du coup une histoire récente.
Your brand is recent. How do you use the storytelling? How do you use that story to increase the perceived value? Because I feel like it's working. Well, the real challenge today is to prove the value. We created the company in March of 2020, so barely 4 years ago. And 2 days after we signed, we had the lockdown. So we needed to adapt development and the business model to offer something different.
Dans un laps de temps très court
and to be able to issue in a short window of time something, not knowing whether in a few months or 6 months or a couple of years we would be able to travel to raise awareness of the product. So we've only been selling watches only for a year. Before that we were selling collaboration. But the value of the watch for me
if I had
a contractor for the movement, a plant for the making of the case, and other players, that value wouldn't be the same. The reason we have that value is because it's been made vertical, it's internal, it's handmade. So we need to demonstrate the legitimacy of the brand, the legitimacy of selling a product at that price, which requires communicating intensely. We were known through the power of American franchises like Star Wars, but after that we needed to ground ourselves and to show our legitimacy in time and to bring it back to watchmaking, because that is what we do. I don't know how much time we have, but I think you said you wanted to avoid people buying your watches out of pure speculative interest. But I think while we have dollars, euros, francs, people will do that. So, Ludo, how could Bitcoin solve that problem of speculation on watches? Do you see a solution? Do you see how they could absorb that monetary problem? And by the way, this isn't just a problem with watches. You said that buying that watch is essentially getting a check. Well, it's true for all good products. If you buy the right pair of Nikes in the morning, maybe by the next day you can sell it for 300 euros more. Well, it's not necessarily my theory, but the theory you're mentioning is that by attracting speculators, Bitcoin has managed to get its price to increase over time. People who buy watches and this type of good as store of value, they do that. But every time you see that product lose a little bit of its value, you put it elsewhere. So you're always looking for a product to invest in. But that's really more speculation than investment. And you're trying to conserve value like this. So Bitcoin, in theory, could be a way to attract that demand.
Pour moi, au-delà de la spéculation, c'est encore une fois, si on devait mettre ensemble Bitcoin et horlogerie, pour moi, ce serait vraiment de voir quelle est la.
If we want to combine watchmaking and Bitcoin, the question really would be, what's the shared value proposition? Beyond speculation, there's the same stakes in both.
On en parlait à midi. Est-ce qu'en période de crise, on revient à l'immobilier?
But there's the material aspect. We were speaking about this at noon. In times of crisis, we come back to harbor values like gold and real estate. Could that happen for those things? Maybe by sharing some community values, sustainability, ethics, transparency, maybe that could be a solution. Nothing to add there? Well, these were all my questions. We're going to take questions from the public, if there are any. I see one.
On a parlé pas mal des aspects de valeur et souvent on a parlé de travail.
We've talked about value and often about work, the work of watchmakers. The cost of a watch is also down to the people who've worked on it for a whole year or even a couple years in the case of independent watchmaking. And there's a parallel I see there. Is that proof of work?
C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, ce qui donne en partie la valeur à l'horlogerie.
What partially gives watches value is that people spend time on it, and you need to prove that time was spent. That creates part of the value.
C'est par rapport, parce qu'en fait, la preuve de travail est quelque chose de central dans Bitcoin.
The proof of work is central in Bitcoin. So maybe we should see a parallel there between a minimal value proposition.
Alors complètement, je vais prendre un exemple très simple pour illustrer.
Yes, totally, and I will take a very simple example to illustrate this. Today you can see an industrial movement such as ETA without a lot of finishing, without any manual operation. But the cost of the movement in the end will be of about 200 francs for normal quality standards. You take the same movement that shows the hour, the minute and the seconds, for instance, Patek Philippe. I believe that you would be then around 7,000-8,000 francs in terms of cost price. And the reference of this cost price is simply the care that was given to the ornaments. Both will be as accurate. The time will be given very accurately as your smartphone actually, but what the one and the other sell is different. And on the one hand you sell the know-how, the ornaments, the fact that the production level cannot be as high as an ETA movement, and an industrial movement on the other hand, which is very basic in its production, and that costs a fraction of the price. So, of course, the work is at the center. Then you have other elements. It's not just watchmaking. There's also all the R&D, the work of marketing teams, the distribution work. Distribution is one of the main challenges for independent watchmakers, how to be well represented, how to educate. The sale of your brand, how can you share your vision, your purpose, because going into a shop of a major brand, well, then they only know how to sell the brand and the crown. It's not a good place for you to sell your independent product. So yes, the human is at the heart of high-end horology, and that's what makes the value of the watch. I will follow up on this because I don't necessarily agree. The value comes from the value. The value comes from the satisfaction the customer draws from the offered service, and this goes through the work of the person that sells the product. So that's how it should be seen, I believe. I believe that work responds to a request from the client that is not clearly formulated, but we hope that we will be able to respond to this demand. But I believe that value does not come from this. That's our biggest disagreement indeed, I believe. But what has to be remembered is that when you talk about Bitcoin, you talk about a unique value that is the same everywhere. If I'm not wrong, the cost of work is the same for everyone, more or less, to produce a Bitcoin. Then there is a value that is the same in China, in the US, or in Neuchâtel. No? Well, more or less. Okay, then there are differences, but they are really minimal.
Ok, mais moi je parle de multiples.
But I'm talking about
par 40, par 50.
Times 10, times 20, times 50. That's what makes the difference. But if someone wants to acquire a Bitcoin for a transaction, they buy a Bitcoin. But what cannot be compared is the one that buys the ETA movement and the one that buys the same movement from Patek Philippe. Those are two different objects, they have the same function, but they don't have the same value. It's like comparing Indian rupees with dollars or bitcoins. As you've said, a watch is not just a material good. There is a history behind, there is the dedication of the craftsperson that is part of the valuation. So there you go, you need to have some nuance. One question. Thank you very much for those very interesting contributions. I'm a Bitcoiner. I'm not a watchmaker at all, so everything I will say about watchmaking comes from my imagination. But I see one connection between the two, and that is the ability to synchronize the ecosystem of an object that is built. Bitcoin is an accounting tool, and once you use it, you realize that we realize that we use it in our ecosystem, and then we do not have any problems with outstanding invoices or outstanding payments. There is a purity in payment transfers, meaning that in an industry where there is still a need for banks to validate audits, to make sure that all transactions were taken into account, here the system is automated and there will be better synchronicity and there will be an industry that will be cheaper and that will have a comparative advantage compared to others. The way I imagine watchmaking, when people started manufacturing watches, they started having more accurate time, and rather than waiting for the bells of the bell towers of the village, people know that they will meet at noon, and as an industry there will be more synchronization and there will be a comparative advantage over other industries. Is this the case? Do you think it's a good example, a good way to compare those two worlds? Yes, I believe this is a good example. Today we could even go further in this demonstration, saying that there is a Swiss industry that is very strong, that is globally recognized for its quality, and that's because the whole of the industry was able to work together and was able to showcase the same know-how, be it for entry-level watches or complication watches that are worth millions. So it is clear that a strong industry is needed, that there needs to be some consistency within the industry. And even though the Bitcoin universe is quite new for me, this is something that I also felt by coming here and by talking to people. There is a level of symbiosis, there is a philosophy that is shared, and I believe that this is very important. You build a bridge with a topic that I'm very interested in, which is regional development. And that's very good about the Jura arc. There are synergies between different areas. So that's where I wanted to bring the reflection. How far could this synchronicity go between watchmaking and cryptocurrency, or the Bitcoin community as we know it in Neuchâtel, because it's different in Neuchâtel and in other places. It's also important to take this into account, and there will be a need, I believe, at some point of a value proposition, and how do we position ourselves and how could we coordinate our tools. I believe that watchmaking would have a lot to learn from Bitcoin-based exchanges to solve some transaction issues. Now, regarding social value proposition, maybe Bitcoin could also draw inspiration from this, but this is just me throwing the gauntlet. So we are known for complications, but I like the simplicity of Bitcoin. Does someone have another question? So Bitcoin is worth about $60,000, and you talked about the watches on the upper floor that are worth that much. I know how to secure a Bitcoin for it not to be stolen by someone else, but do you have particular buckles that would prevent someone to just open the watch and take it when you're walking on the street? Yes, there are specific closing mechanisms. We don't offer them, but I have one client who is quite passionate about those types of closing buckles. When I designed the watch, I really wanted to have a whole integrated design. That's why there are no sharp angles. It's very comfortable to wear. But of course, there are ways of securing the wristband. There are also insurances, and I believe this is a good opportunity for me to say that cryptocurrencies or the blockchain generally could have something to bring. When it comes to asset portfolios, maybe this is something that could be interesting for insurances, because there are, unfortunately, nowadays more and more big cities where many luxury watches are stolen. For Kross Studio, we are only starting. We're not very well known, so if you buy a watch with us, you will have a few years of relative quietness. Are there any other questions? I'm coming.
Merci pour
l'échange. Thank you for this interesting exchange. This is not really a question, and I'm sorry for watchmakers. This is something that's more for Ludovic, who talked to us about the value of Bitcoin. I was a bit surprised that you did not mention what, for me, is one of the most fundamental value propositions of Bitcoin, and that is its particular nature. Satoshi gave Bitcoin to humanity, and this is also about the way the network was launched. And I believe this is the fundamental difference between Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrency. Regardless of the value proposition, I thought this was a missing link or missing element in your presentation. Yes, that's very relevant. I did not talk about all this, but this is something that underlies everything that I said. This is really the emergence of a robust digital money idea project without any centralized institution behind it. I completely agree with you.
Peut-être dernière question.
Maybe one last question, or two last questions. Yes, just to go a bit further on what was just said. I was also surprised that you did not mention elegance, unless I was sleeping when you did. And there's also something that wasn't mentioned. Maybe I'm the only one to think it, but part of the value of Bitcoin, in my view, is based on the idea of you don't like it, well, I do. So the fact that some people dislike it can be a source of joy when you have it, when you use Bitcoin. And we mentioned the fact that it's the same price everywhere, but nothing adds value to it than its ban. So my mischievous comment, you don't like it, well, I do, is part of the value of it, in addition to its presence on the black market. And Bitcoin concentrates more tax from the public sector than other systems. Yes, when people see all bad politicians criticize Bitcoin, it might encourage them to go for it. Yeah, regarding elegance, I did not really mention it, but this is also part of the technical curiosity, which I mentioned in one slide. People are fascinated with technology, with its simplicity. The Bitcoin system is relatively simple if you look at the basic principles of mining. Compared with the current financial system, it's quite simple. And of course, there is all the beautiful history of an individual that created Bitcoin and then left without ever using those Bitcoins. It's very selfless from Satoshi to never want to gain any profit from everything he mined, because he mined a lot of Bitcoins. Is there a final question? Doesn't look like it. All right. Thank you all for listening to us. Thank you to all the speakers.
Voilà, je vous remercie.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Unfortunately, I could not attend all conferences, but everything I attended was absolutely fascinating. I do not know if Bitcoin and watchmaking are sister industries, but in any case, bridges were built, there were some discussions, there were very interesting debates. Thank you all for coming. It's not the end of the Bitcoin paradigm. There is another day tomorrow, and we will continue those discussions tomorrow, and we will use this first contact with the watchmaking industry. It's a first stage, and I believe that this first contact, if I were to summarize the day, is quite a positive one. And I believe that there are things that we will be able to build in Neuchâtel. We haven't waited for watchmaking to start building, but with watchmaking we will be stronger. And I hope that we will also be able to strengthen watchmaking in our canton. Thank you all. Just for information, and for the after, it is at the Parc des Crétés, where a festival called Lamus Park is taking place. We were there yesterday evening, for those who were already there. It's really nice. There are live music, beers, you can pay with Bitcoins. Otherwise, I wish you a good rest of the day.